What if I told you that nearly 2,000 years ago, a Bedouin shepherd boy threw a rock into a cave and accidentally uncovered the most controversial religious discovery in human history? A discovery so explosive that religious institutions have spent decades trying to control the narrative around it. Today, we're diving deep into the complete, unfiltered story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, including the shocking revelations that challenge everything you thought you knew about early Christianity and Judaism. You're about to learn why this discovery sent shockwaves through the religious world. But before we get into it, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like button and subscribing if you haven't already. It helps a lot. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're building a global community here, so you can meet and connect with like-minded folks from around the world in the comment section down below. So without further ado, let's begin, shall we? A young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib walking through the rocky cliffs near the Dead Sea in 1947. The sun beats down on limestone walls that have stood silent for 2,000 years. His goat has wandered off somewhere among the caves. He picks up a stone, throws it into the darkness of a cave opening. Instead of the dull thud he expects, he hears something shatter, clay breaking, pottery splitting apart after centuries of patient waiting. Muhammad climbs down into the cave. His eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the entrance. Tall clay jars line the walls like ancient sentries. Some have already cracked open, spilling their contents onto the cave floor. Inside these vessels, wrapped in linen cloth, lie scrolls of parchment and papyrus. The shepherd cannot read the strange writing covering these documents. Hebrew letters dance across surfaces that haven't seen daylight since Roman legions marched through these hills. But something tells him these objects carry weight beyond their physical presence. They feel important in a way that makes his hands tremble slightly as he lifts them. Muhammad takes several scrolls back to his camp. His family examines them with curiosity mixed with caution. Desert people understand that ancient things often bring both fortune and trouble. They decide to take the scrolls to Bethlehem, where antiquities dealers might offer a fair price. The dealer who first sees these documents recognizes immediately that they represent something extraordinary. The writing style belongs to a period long before the Common Era. The parchment bears the particular texture that comes only from great age. More importantly, the text itself contains phrases and passages that sound familiar yet different from known religious writings. Word spreads quietly through networks of scholars and collectors. A Syrian Orthodox archbishop named Athanasius Yeshu Samuel purchases 4 of the scrolls. Professor Eleazar Sukenik from Hebrew University acquires 3 others. Both men sense they have encountered something that could reshape understanding of ancient religious history. The scrolls begin their journey from cave to laboratory. Carbon dating will later confirm what scholars suspect from the start. These documents were written between the 3rd century before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era. They represent one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the modern age. But even as excitement builds among academics, other forces take notice. Religious institutions begin asking careful questions about the content of these texts. What stories do they tell? Which beliefs do they support or challenge? How might they affect established teachings that have guided millions of believers for centuries? The shepherd's throw that shattered clay in a forgotten cave has set in motion events that will unfold across decades. Scholars will battle over access to the scrolls. Governments will claim ownership. Religious leaders will grapple with implications they never anticipated. Muhammad ed-Dib could not have known that his simple act of looking for a lost goat would unlock secrets that certain people had hoped would remain buried forever. The cave held more than ancient documents. It contained questions that would challenge the very foundations of religious authority. They had no idea what they had just found, but the church did. The scroll that shouldn't exist. The Dead Sea Scrolls emerged from their cave carrying the weight of 2,000 years of silence. These weren't ordinary ancient documents discovered by archaeologists following careful excavation procedures. They appeared suddenly, unexpectedly, in the hands of Bedouin shepherds who had no understanding of their significance. More than simple historical artifacts, these scrolls represent a library, an entire collection of texts that someone had carefully gathered, copied, and preserved before hiding them away. The variety astonishes even experienced scholars. Biblical texts appear alongside previously unknown religious writings. Community rules sit next to apocalyptic visions. Prayer books rest beside commentaries on ancient prophecies. The scrolls offer a window into a world that existed during one of the most pivotal periods in religious history. They come from the centuries immediately before and during the time when Christianity emerged from its Jewish roots. This timing makes them invaluable for understanding how religious ideas developed and spread. But their value extends beyond academic interest. These documents contain perspectives on faith, law, and divine purpose that sometimes align with traditional teachings and sometimes diverge dramatically. They preserve voices that were eventually silenced as certain religious movements gained dominance over others. The discovery forces uncomfortable questions into the open. Which version of ancient events should be considered authoritative? How much influence did various Jewish sects have on early Christian thinking? What beliefs and practices were deliberately excluded from later religious traditions? Religious institutions find themselves facing a challenge they hadn't anticipated in the modern era. For centuries, they had controlled the narrative about ancient faith. They decided which texts would be considered sacred and which would be forgotten. They determined what believers should know about the origins of their religion. The scrolls bypass this traditional gatekeeping entirely. They speak directly from the past without the filter of later interpretation. They preserve ideas that powerful groups had reasons to suppress. They offer evidence that the development of religious thought was far more complex and contested than official histories suggest. Academic scholars recognize immediately that these documents will require decades of careful study. The texts need to be photographed, transcribed, translated, and analyzed. Each scroll must be compared with known writings to identify relationships and influences. The work demands expertise in ancient languages, religious history, and archaeological methodology. Yet, even as the scholarly community prepares for this massive undertaking, other dynamics begin to shape the process. Political considerations intrude on academic ones. Religious sensitivities influence decisions about which texts receive priority attention. National interests affect how the scrolls are distributed among research institutions. The stage is set for conflicts that will simmer for decades. Scholars will compete for access to unpublished materials. Religious leaders will work to minimize potential damage to established doctrines. Governments will use the scrolls to support their own historical narratives. Hidden beneath these surface tensions lies a deeper truth. The scrolls represent knowledge that certain groups never intended to become public. They preserve perspectives that were meant to remain buried in desert caves. They challenge assumptions that have shaped religious thought for 2 millennia. The discovery marks the beginning of a story that continues to unfold today. Each newly translated text raises fresh questions. Each scholarly analysis reveals additional complexities. Each attempt to suppress or control information about the scrolls generates more public interest in their contents. The scrolls refuse to remain silent any longer. They carry hidden truths that some believe the church has never wanted people to learn. The sect in the sand, beyond the limestone cliffs where the scrolls lay hidden, a community once thrived in the harsh wilderness near the Dead Sea. Around 150 years before the Common Era, members of a Jewish sect established themselves at a place called Qumran. They came seeking purity in the desert, fleeing what they saw as corruption in Jerusalem's temples. These people called themselves the Sons of Light. History knows them as the Essenes. They believed the end times were approaching rapidly, and only through perfect adherence to divine law could they prepare for the final battle between good and evil. Their settlement emerged slowly from the desert floor. Stone buildings rose around natural water sources. Ritual baths carved from rock allowed for the constant purification their beliefs demanded. Workshops provided space for copying sacred texts. Storage rooms held provisions for a community that expected to outlast the apocalypse. The Essenes lived according to strict rules that governed every aspect of daily life. They shared all possessions in common, believing private ownership bred corruption. They ate meals together in sacred silence, viewing each bite as a holy act. They bathed multiple times each day, washing away impurities, both physical and spiritual. New members underwent years of preparation before joining fully. They studied community laws, practiced ritual observances, and proved their commitment through increasingly demanding tests. Those who succeeded gained access to secret teachings that the group guarded carefully from outsiders. The community's scribes worked continuously, copying texts by candlelight and oil lamps. They reproduced books of the Hebrew Bible, but also created new writings that reflected their distinctive beliefs. Prophetic commentaries explained how ancient predictions were being fulfilled in their own time. Rule books outlined proper behavior for community members. Apocalyptic visions described the coming cosmic war. Their library grew year by year, scroll by scroll. Each text was copied with meticulous care, checked for accuracy, and stored in clay jars designed to protect parchment from desert conditions. The community viewed this work as preparation for Judgment Day, when only those who possessed true knowledge would survive. Daily routines followed patterns established by religious law and community custom. Members rose before dawn for prayers and ritual washing. They worked in gardens, workshops, and scriptoriums during daylight hours. Evenings brought communal meals and study sessions where teachers explained sacred mysteries to devoted students. The settlement included quarters for different groups within the community. Priests held positions of highest authority, followed by other members according to their spiritual development. Newcomers lived separately until they proved worthy of full membership. Even seating arrangements at meals reflected this careful hierarchy. Women and children had places in the community, though their roles remain less clear from surviving evidence. Some texts suggest families lived at Qumran, while others imply the core group practiced celibacy. The community may have included both married and unmarried members following different paths toward the same spiritual goals. Their isolation wasn't complete. The Essenes maintained connections with sympathizers in Jerusalem and other cities. They received news about political developments and religious controversies, but they remained convinced that only in the desert could they maintain the purity necessary for surviving the coming judgment. As decades passed, the community grew more certain that the end was approaching. Roman occupation of Judea seemed to fulfill ancient prophecies about foreign domination. Corruption in the Jerusalem temple appeared to signal the final breakdown of proper worship. Wars and natural disasters suggested that cosmic forces were aligning for the ultimate confrontation. The Essenes prepared accordingly. They intensified their copying of sacred texts, ensuring that divine knowledge would survive whatever destruction might come. They refined their rules for righteous living, believing that only perfect communities would endure the tribulation. They composed new prayers and hymns for use in the purified temple they expected God to establish after victory. Their story was one of patient waiting combined with urgent preparation. They believed they were living in the last days, but they also planned for a future when their preserved wisdom would guide a renewed world. Enemies of Jerusalem. The religious landscape of ancient Judea contained far more diversity than most people realize today. Multiple Jewish groups competed for influence and followers during the centuries before the Common Era. Each claimed to represent authentic tradition while accusing others of dangerous innovation or corruption. The Pharisees emphasized careful interpretation of written law, combined with oral traditions passed down through generations. They believed that divine commands required detailed explanation to address changing circumstances. Their approach allowed Judaism to adapt while maintaining core principles. The Sadducees controlled the temple in Jerusalem and the priesthood that conducted its rituals. They accepted only written scriptures as authoritative, rejecting the oral traditions that Pharisees valued. Their power depended on maintaining good relationships with foreign rulers who controlled Judean politics. The Zealots advocated violent resistance against Roman occupation. They viewed foreign rule as a violation of divine sovereignty that justified armed rebellion. Some carried out assassinations of collaborators and attacks on Roman officials and their supporters. The Essenes rejected all these approaches as fundamentally flawed. They saw the Pharisees as too willing to compromise with worldly concerns. They viewed the Sadducees as corrupt collaborators who had polluted the temple through improper practices. They considered the Zealots misguided in their methods, even while sharing their goal of liberation. More than theological differences separated these groups. Political calculations shaped their positions on questions of law and practice. Economic interests influenced their attitudes toward foreign rule. Social factors determined which teachings would appeal to different audiences. The Pharisees drew support from merchants, craftsmen, and others who needed religious guidance for daily business dealings. Their detailed interpretations of law provided practical answers for people living in a complex commercial society. Their synagogue system created local centers of learning and worship independent of temple control. The Sadducees maintained their position through collaboration with Roman authorities, who found them useful for managing Jewish affairs. Their control of temple sacrifices and festivals gave them influence over religious life throughout Judea. Their aristocratic backgrounds connected them with wealthy families who benefited from stability. The Zealots attracted followers among peasants and urban poor who suffered most under foreign taxation and local corruption. Their call for resistance resonated with people who had little to lose from violent upheaval. Their willingness to die for their beliefs inspired others to similar sacrifice. The Essenes appealed to those seeking spiritual perfection through withdrawal from compromised society. Their promise of secret knowledge attracted intellectuals dissatisfied with conventional answers. Their communal lifestyle offered security for those willing to surrender individual autonomy. These differences created opportunities for conflict that went far beyond academic debate. Groups accused each other of heresy, corruption, and betrayal. They competed for control of synagogues, schools, and other institutions. They sought support from foreign powers when convenient for their purposes. The Essenes positioned themselves as the only pure remnant of authentic Judaism. They viewed Jerusalem's temple as hopelessly corrupted by improper priests following false interpretations of law. They expected divine judgment to destroy all competing groups while vindicating their own righteousness. Their writings preserve harsh criticisms of other Jewish leaders whom they identified with biblical villains and false prophets. They developed elaborate theories about how corruption had entered religious institutions through foreign influence and domestic compromise. They predicted that only their community would survive the coming apocalypse. This sectarian environment shaped early Christian development in ways that become clearer through studying the scrolls. Many ideas that appear distinctively Christian actually existed within Judaism before Jesus began his ministry. Concepts like ritual baptism, communal meals, and dualistic thinking about cosmic warfare appeared in multiple Jewish groups. The boundaries between sects remained fluid despite their mutual hostility. Individuals sometimes moved from one group to another as their beliefs evolved. Ideas crossed factional lines through shared texts and personal relationships. Common concerns about foreign rule and religious authenticity created occasional alliances against external threats. Understanding this diversity helps explain why the scrolls represent such a challenge to later religious orthodoxy. They preserve perspectives that were eventually marginalized as certain groups gained dominance over others. They document beliefs and practices that official histories chose to forget. Chronicles of Chaos, the Scrolls as Resistance. The scrolls found at Qumran carried messages that went far beyond religious instruction. They functioned as resistance literature, preserving critiques of political and religious authority that their authors considered deeply corrupt. These texts challenged not only foreign rule, but also domestic collaboration with it. Many scrolls attacked the Jerusalem temple establishment with language that would have been considered treasonous by both Jewish and Roman authorities. The authors described current priests as illegitimate usurpers who had polluted sacred rituals through improper practices and foreign influence. One text refers to the official priesthood as sons of darkness, who serve evil rather than divine purposes. Another describes temple sacrifices as abominations that anger rather than please God. These weren't merely theological disagreements, but direct challenges to institutions that formed the foundation of Jewish religious, and political life. The scrolls also contained coded references to contemporary political figures that scholars continue to debate. Names like the wicked priest and the man of lies appear to designate specific leaders whom the authors viewed as enemies of righteousness. The Kittim likely refers to Romans, described as a foreign force bringing destruction and oppression. Beyond criticism, the scrolls outlined alternative visions for religious and social organization. They described communities where wealth was shared equally, decisions were made collectively, and leadership was based on spiritual merit rather than inherited position or political connections. These ideals directly contradicted the hierarchical structures that dominated both Jewish and Roman society. The suggestion that common people could organize themselves according to divine law without reference to established authorities represented a fundamental challenge to existing power relationships. The scrolls preserved detailed rules for community governance that minimized individual authority while maximizing collective responsibility. Leaders served temporary terms and faced removal for misconduct. Decisions required consensus rather than dictatorial decree. Even punishment was administered through group processes rather than individual judgment. Economic arrangements described in the scrolls reflected similar principles. Members contributed all personal property to common funds managed by elected officials. Distribution of resources followed principles of need rather than status or contribution. Work assignments rotated to prevent the emergence of permanent class divisions. These practices weren't merely theoretical ideals, but practical arrangements that the Qumran community actually implemented. Archaeological evidence confirms that the settlement included workshops, storage facilities, and meeting rooms designed to support collective life. The absence of luxury items or individual wealth accumulation supports textual descriptions of economic equality. The scrolls also contained apocalyptic literature that predicted the violent overthrow of current religious and political arrangements. They described cosmic wars between forces of light and darkness that would result in the destruction of existing institutions and the establishment of divine rule. These visions weren't passive hopes for divine intervention, but active preparation for participation in coming conflicts. The texts include detailed descriptions of military organization, weapons, and battle tactics that suggest the authors expected to fight rather than simply witness the apocalypse. The War Scroll provides extensive instructions for organizing an army of the righteous that would assist angelic forces in defeating earthly and spiritual enemies. It describes troop formations, signal systems, and ceremonial procedures for conducting holy warfare against corrupt opponents. Such materials would have been considered seditious by Roman authorities who viewed apocalyptic movements as potential sources of rebellion. They would also have alarmed Jewish leaders who preferred accommodation with foreign rule to the risks of violent confrontation. The preservation of these texts required considerable courage from community members who knew that possession of such materials could result in severe punishment. The decision to hide scrolls in desert caves rather than destroy them suggests the authors believed their messages would eventually find appropriate audiences. The scrolls thus represent more than religious literature. They document a sustained critique of political and religious authority that their authors considered fundamentally illegitimate. They preserve alternative visions for social organization that challenged basic assumptions about power and hierarchy. Their discovery in the modern era has created similar challenges for religious institutions that prefer not to acknowledge the extent of ancient diversity within Jewish and early Christian traditions. The scrolls demonstrate that resistance to established authority has deep roots in religious history. The Secret Archive. Creating the library hidden at Qumran required extraordinary dedication and sophisticated organization. The community's scribes worked for generations to assemble, copy, and preserve texts that they believed contained essential knowledge for surviving the end times. The physical process of scroll production demanded specialized skills and materials that weren't easily obtained in the desert. Scribes needed parchment made from carefully prepared animal skins, inks mixed according to precise formulas, and writing implements crafted for detailed work on delicate surfaces. Parchment preparation began with selecting appropriate animal hides that would provide smooth, durable writing surfaces. The skins underwent weeks of treatment involving soaking, scraping, stretching, and chemical processing to remove hair and fat while preserving flexibility and strength. Ink production required knowledge of chemistry that scribes guarded as trade secrets. The best inks combined carbon black with plant-based binders that would resist fading over centuries. Some texts were written with metallic inks that provided greater permanence but required more expensive materials. The scribes themselves represented the intellectual elite of their community. They possessed literacy skills that were rare in ancient society, combined with deep knowledge of religious law and tradition. Their training included not only technical writing abilities, but also theological education that enabled them to understand and transmit complex religious concepts. Different scribes specialized in different types of texts, developing distinctive styles that modern scholars can identify and track across multiple documents. Some focused on biblical materials, copying books of Hebrew scripture with meticulous attention to textual accuracy. Others concentrated on community rules, legal commentaries, or apocalyptic literature. The community maintained strict quality control over its scribal work. Texts were checked multiple times for accuracy before being accepted for the permanent collection. Errors required complete recopying rather than correction, ensuring that the archive contained only perfect versions of important materials. Storage systems reflected the community's understanding that their library needed to survive indefinitely. Clay jars were manufactured according to designs that would protect scrolls from moisture, insects, and other environmental threats. The jars were sealed with pitch and stored in caves that provided stable temperature and humidity conditions. Some texts received special treatment that suggests their particular importance to the community. The copper scroll was inscribed on metal sheets that would survive conditions that might destroy parchment. Other documents were wrapped in multiple layers of linen cloth before being placed in jars. The community organized its collection according to categories that reflected their religious priorities. Biblical texts were separated from sectarian writings. Legal materials were distinguished from liturgical ones. Apocalyptic literature was kept apart from community rules and administrative documents. Catalog systems helped librarians locate specific texts within the growing collection. While no complete inventory has survived, fragments suggest that the community maintained detailed records of which materials were stored in which locations. This organization would have been essential for a library that eventually included hundreds of individual documents. The archive included materials that the community didn't create themselves but considered important enough to preserve. Copies of texts produced by other Jewish groups appear alongside distinctively Essene writings. Some documents may have been acquired through purchase, trade, or other forms of exchange with outside communities. Certain texts were designated as secret knowledge available only to fully initiated members of the community. These materials contained advanced theological teachings, mystical practices, or prophetic revelations that weren't suitable for general circulation. Access to such texts marked important stages in a member's spiritual development. The decision to hide the entire collection suggests that community leaders recognized that Roman forces were approaching and that the settlement would likely be destroyed. Rather than allow their precious library to fall into hostile hands or be lost forever, they chose to preserve it for future discovery. The care taken in this preservation process demonstrates how highly the community valued its accumulated knowledge. They believed these texts contained information essential for understanding divine will and preparing for the end times. Their successful concealment ensured that modern scholars would eventually gain access to perspectives that might otherwise have been lost forever. Fire and Sand, the Fall of Qumran. The year 68 CE brought Roman legions sweeping through Judea with devastating efficiency. The first Jewish revolt had been raging for 2 years, and Roman commanders were determined to crush all resistance with overwhelming force. No settlement, no matter how remote, would be allowed to serve as a refuge for rebels. Archaeological evidence tells the story of Qumran's final days through layers of ash, broken pottery, and hastily abandoned possessions. Coins found in the ruins date to the fourth year of the revolt, providing a precise timeline for the community's destruction. The pattern of damage suggests a deliberate assault rather than gradual abandonment. Roman forces approached from multiple directions, cutting off escape routes and ensuring that no residents could flee to warn other settlements. The attack came swiftly, giving the community little time to prepare defenses or evacuate valuable possessions. Most buildings show signs of fire damage consistent with systematic destruction. The Essenes had never been warriors in the conventional sense. Their preparations for cosmic battle involved spiritual purification and ritual practice rather than military training. When faced with Roman professionals, they had little hope of mounting effective resistance. Yet, someone in the community had prepared for this possibility. The systematic hiding of scrolls in nearby caves suggests advanced planning rather than desperate improvisation. The care taken to seal jars and protect documents indicates that community leaders expected their settlement to be destroyed, but hoped their library might survive. The process of concealing the scrolls must have required considerable time and effort. Heavy clay jars filled with precious documents needed to be transported to remote caves and carefully positioned to avoid detection. The work would have required multiple trips by several people working under extreme time pressure. Some scholars suggest that the community had been preparing for this eventuality for months or even years. Roman forces had been operating throughout Judea, destroying settlements suspected of supporting rebels. The Essenes would have known that their isolation provided only temporary protection. The selection of materials for preservation reveals the community's priorities in their final hours. Biblical texts were saved alongside sectarian writings, suggesting that both were considered equally important for future generations. Legal documents and administrative records were largely left behind, indicating that practical concerns gave way to spiritual ones. The physical evidence suggests that most community members either died during the attack or were captured and removed as prisoners. Bodies haven't been found at the site, but Roman practice involved clearing battlefields and disposing of casualties away from areas they intended to occupy or traverse. Some residents may have escaped into the surrounding wilderness before the attack began. Desert terrain that hindered Roman mobility could have provided refuge for small groups familiar with local conditions. However, survival in such harsh environment would have required resources and knowledge that sedentary community members might not have possessed. The fate of escaped Essenes remains one of history's mysteries. Some scholars suggest they joined other Jewish communities and integrated their distinctive beliefs into broader religious movements. Others propose that they maintained separate groups that eventually influenced early Christian development. Qumran itself was abandoned after the Roman assault and never reoccupied as a religious center. The buildings gradually crumbled under desert conditions, leaving only foundations and scattered artifacts for modern archaeologists to discover. The settlement's brief flourishing had ended in violence and destruction. The community's careful preservation of their library proved more successful than their attempts to preserve their physical presence. The scrolls remained hidden in their caves for nearly 2,000 years, waiting for accidental discovery by a Bedouin shepherd who had no understanding of their significance. Roman efficiency in suppressing the revolt ensured that knowledge of the Qumran community and its beliefs disappeared from historical memory. Later, Jewish and Christian writers made no reference to the Essenes' distinctive teachings or their hidden archive. The successful concealment became also a successful erasure. The destruction of Qumran marked the end of one chapter in the scroll's story, but also the beginning of another. Hidden in darkness, sealed in clay, the texts entered a period of silent waiting that would last until the modern era brought them back into the light of human knowledge. The shepherd and the black market. Muhammad Edh-Dhib had no idea that his discovery would eventually reshape understanding of ancient religion. The young Bedouin simply knew that the scrolls might bring enough money to improve his family's circumstances. Desert life provided few opportunities for sudden wealth, and these strange documents seemed to offer exactly that possibility. The journey from cave to marketplace began with careful consideration of where to take the scrolls for evaluation. Bethlehem hosted several antiquities dealers who served collectors from Jerusalem, Europe, and America. These merchants had experience evaluating ancient objects and connections to buyers who paid substantial sums for genuine artifacts. The first dealer to examine the scrolls recognized immediately that they represented something exceptional. The Hebrew script belonged to a period long before the Common Era. The parchment showed appropriate aging for documents of great antiquity. Most importantly, the text itself contained passages that seemed both familiar and strangely different from known religious writings. Word of the discovery spread quickly through networks of scholars, collectors, and religious figures who maintained interests in biblical archaeology. Each group approached the scrolls with different motivations and different ideas about what should happen to them. Syrian Orthodox Archbishop Athanasius Yeshu Samuel emerged as one of the first serious buyers. He purchased 4 scrolls for what seemed like a reasonable price to the Bedouin sellers, but represented only a fraction of their eventual value. Samuel recognized that the documents might contain materials relevant to early Christian history. Professor Eleazar Sukenik from Hebrew University acquired 3 additional scrolls through separate negotiations. His academic background enabled him to appreciate their scholarly significance even before detailed translation work began. He understood that these texts could provide unprecedented insights into Jewish religious development. The remaining scrolls entered a complex web of dealers, collectors, and institutions that would take years to untangle. Some changed hands multiple times as their value became apparent. Others disappeared into private collections where they remained hidden from scholarly examination for decades. The antiquities trade operated according to informal rules that prioritized profit over archaeological preservation. Dealers had little interest in documenting where objects came from or how they were found. Such information might complicate ownership claims or reduce market values by raising questions about legal acquisition. Bedouin sellers found themselves caught between traditional desert customs and modern legal systems they didn't understand. Their discovery of the scrolls gave them moral claims to ownership, but various governments and institutions asserted legal authority over archaeological materials found within their territories. The scrolls' journey through black market channels created lasting problems for scholars who eventually gained access to them. The lack of proper archaeological documentation made it difficult to understand the original context of the discovery. Important information about how the texts were stored and what other materials might have been associated with them was lost forever. Some scrolls were damaged during their time in private hands as dealers and collectors attempted to improve their appearance or divided them into smaller pieces that could be sold separately. These interventions destroyed evidence that might have helped scholars understand how the documents were originally organized and preserved. The commercial value of the scrolls attracted forgers who began producing fake documents to meet collector demand. Distinguishing authentic ancient texts from modern imitations required sophisticated analysis that wasn't always available to buyers operating in underground markets. Several prominent forgeries weren't exposed until decades after their initial sale. International tensions complicated efforts to establish clear ownership of the scrolls. The 1947 discovery occurred during the final months of the British Mandate for Palestine, just before the establishment of Israel and the First Arab-Israeli War. Political upheaval made it difficult to establish legal frameworks for handling archaeological discoveries. Different governments claimed authority over the scrolls based on where they were found, where they were sold, and which institutions eventually acquired them. These competing claims would influence access to the materials for decades, as political considerations shaped decisions about which scholars could study particular texts. The involvement of religious institutions added another layer of complexity to ownership questions. Churches and universities that purchased scrolls argued that their scholarly missions justified their acquisition of the materials. However, their religious interests also influenced how they approached research and publication of potentially controversial findings. The shepherd's simple desire to profit from his discovery had unleashed forces that would affect the scrolls for generations. Commercial, political, and religious considerations would all play roles in determining how these ancient texts would be studied, interpreted, and shared with the world. The church enters the chat news of the scroll discovery, reached religious institutions through networks of scholars, diplomats, and collectors who understood the potential implications of ancient religious texts. The Catholic Church, with its extensive scholarly apparatus and historical experience managing sensitive archaeological discoveries, quickly recognized the need for involvement. Vatican officials approached the situation with characteristic caution. Their initial interest focused on determining whether the scrolls contained materials relevant to early Christian history. If the texts proved significant, the Church wanted to ensure that qualified scholars with appropriate religious sensitivity would guide their interpretation. The Jerusalem office of the École biblique et archéologique française became a crucial point of contact between the Church and the scroll investigation. This Dominican institution had established itself as a center for biblical scholarship in the Holy Land, combining rigorous academic standards with orthodox theological perspectives. Father Roland Deveau emerged as a central figure in early scroll research. His background in biblical archaeology and his position within Catholic academic circles made him an ideal candidate to represent church interests while maintaining scholarly credibility. His appointment to leadership positions in scroll research would prove influential for decades. The Israeli government also asserted strong claims over the scrolls as archaeological treasures found within territory under its control. Officials argued that these materials represented part of Jewish heritage that belonged in Israeli institutions rather than foreign collections. However, political complications arising from the 1948 war limited their immediate ability to secure all the materials. American scholarly institutions entered the picture through their existing relationships with Middle Eastern archaeological projects. Universities and museums that had supported excavations in Palestine and Jordan possessed expertise, funding, and international connections that made them valuable partners in scroll research. The Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem became a focal point for international collaboration on scroll research. Originally established during the British Mandate, the museum provided neutral ground where scholars from different countries and institutions could work together on materials that might otherwise have become subjects of political dispute. John D. Rockefeller Jr. had funded the museum's construction and continued to support its operations through his philanthropic foundation. This American financial backing gave the institution independence from direct government control while ensuring adequate resources for complex research projects requiring years of careful work. Religious sensitivities shaped early decisions about how scroll research should be organized and conducted. Church officials wanted to ensure that potentially controversial materials would be interpreted by scholars who understood the implications of various findings for contemporary religious belief and practice. The composition of the initial research team reflected these concerns. Catholic scholars received prominent positions, while Protestant and Jewish researchers found their access more limited. Secular academics were largely excluded from early phases of the work, despite their potential contributions to linguistic and historical analysis. This religious influence extended to decisions about which scrolls would receive priority attention and how quickly various texts would be published. Materials that seemed to support traditional religious narratives were studied and released more rapidly than those that might raise difficult questions about established doctrines. The Church's involvement brought both advantages and disadvantages to scroll research. Religious institutions possessed resources, expertise, and international connections that facilitated complex scholarly work. However, their theological commitments also created potential conflicts between academic objectivity and religious orthodoxy. Funding for scroll research came partly from religious sources that had specific expectations about how the work should be conducted and what kinds of conclusions would be acceptable. These financial arrangements created subtle pressures that influenced scholarly priorities and publication decisions. The selection of Jerusalem as the primary location for scroll research placed the materials in a politically sensitive environment where religious, national, and academic interests intersected in complex ways. Decisions about access, interpretation, and publication would need to navigate these multiple competing claims. The Church's entry into scroll research established patterns that would persist for decades. Religious institutions would continue to play important roles in funding, organizing, and interpreting the materials. However, their involvement would also generate criticism from scholars who believed theological concerns were compromising academic integrity. The scrolls that vanished. As scroll research progressed through the 1950s and 1960s, troubling patterns began to emerge regarding the availability of certain materials for scholarly examination. Texts that had been cataloged and photographed seemed to disappear from active research projects without explanation. Other documents were described in general terms but never made available for independent analysis. The most dramatic example involved materials that came to be known as the secret scrolls. Early reports from the research team mentioned texts containing unusual theological content that required careful evaluation before publication. These documents were photographed and preliminary translations were prepared, but the materials then vanished from public discussion. Rumors circulated within academic circles about scroll fragments that contained passages challenging traditional biblical narratives. Some stories described texts that presented alternative accounts of events described in canonical scriptures. Others mentioned materials that suggested connections between Jewish sectarian movements and early Christian groups. The research team developed a classification system that seemed designed to limit access to potentially controversial materials. Certain texts were designated as requiring special handling due to their fragile condition or preliminary state of analysis. These classifications often became permanent barriers to independent scholarly examination. Father DeVoe and his colleagues maintained strict control over which materials would be made available to outside researchers. They argued that premature publication of poorly understood texts could lead to misinterpretation and sensational coverage that would damage serious scholarship. However, critics suspected that religious considerations influenced these decisions. Some scrolls that had been described in early reports simply disappeared from later publications and scholarly discussions. When questioned about specific texts, research team members claimed that the materials had been lost, stolen, or proven to be forgeries upon closer examination. However, they provided little evidence to support these explanations. The photography archives maintained by the research team became another source of controversy. Scholars who requested access to images of particular texts were told that photographs had been damaged, misfiled, or were unavailable for technical reasons. The centralized control of visual documentation made it impossible to verify these claims independently. Certain scroll fragments were combined with other materials in ways that made their original content difficult to reconstruct. When scholars later gained access to these composite documents, they found it nearly impossible to determine what text had originally appeared on specific pieces of parchment. The research team's publication schedule seemed to reflect priorities that weren't entirely academic. Biblical texts that confirmed traditional religious narratives appeared in print relatively quickly. Sectarian materials that raised questions about early Jewish and Christian development remained unpublished for decades. Vatican involvement in scroll research created additional concerns about potential suppression of problematic materials. The Church had historical experience managing archaeological discoveries that might challenge religious orthodoxy. Critics worried that similar considerations were influencing decisions about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some researchers who worked on the scrolls during the early decades later admitted that they had been instructed to avoid certain topics in their publications. These informal guidelines discouraged discussion of materials that might prove embarrassing to religious institutions or that could fuel anti-religious propaganda during the Cold War period. The geographical distribution of scroll materials created additional opportunities for selective suppression. Fragments were scattered among institutions in Jerusalem, Europe, and America, making it difficult for any single scholar to gain access to complete texts. This fragmentation also made it harder to detect when materials were being deliberately withheld from examination. Private collectors who had acquired scroll fragments during the early years after their discovery sometimes refused to make their materials available for scholarly study. These individuals had paid substantial sums for ancient documents and were reluctant to allow access that might reduce their commercial value or raise questions about ownership. The development of carbon dating and other scientific analysis techniques created new opportunities for scroll authentication, but also new reasons for certain parties to limit access to materials. Tests that might prove documents were forgeries or had been altered could destroy both scholarly reputations and substantial financial investments. Language barriers provided another mechanism for controlling access to scroll contents. Many potentially significant fragments remained untranslated for decades because qualified linguists were denied access to the materials. When translations were eventually prepared, they sometimes differed significantly from earlier descriptions of the same texts. The establishment of Israel as an independent nation created new political dynamics around scroll ownership and access. Israeli authorities wanted to ensure that materials representing Jewish heritage would be properly preserved and interpreted. However, this legitimate concern also provided cover for decisions that were motivated by religious rather than purely scholarly considerations. International tensions during the Cold War period influenced attitudes towards scroll research in unexpected ways. Western institutions worried that controversial archaeological findings could be exploited by communist propaganda efforts aimed at undermining religious faith. These concerns encouraged conservative approaches to publication and interpretation. The scrolls that vanished represent one of the most troubling aspects of early scroll research. Their disappearance suggests that some materials contained information that powerful institutions preferred to keep hidden. The loss of these texts impoverished scholarly understanding of ancient religious development and raised lasting questions about academic integrity in biblical archaeology. Modern efforts to reconstruct the contents of missing scrolls rely on fragmentary evidence from early reports, photographs, and scholarly correspondence. These investigations have revealed tantalizing hints about materials that might have transformed understanding of early Judaism and Christianity if they had been properly preserved and studied. The pattern of selective suppression established during the early decades of scroll research created a climate of suspicion that continues to influence the field today. Scholars approach new discoveries with awareness that institutional interests might conflict with academic objectivity, requiring vigilance to ensure that important findings reach the broader scholarly community. The academic lockdown picture a room in Jerusalem's Rockefeller Museum. Sunlight filters through dusty windows, casting shadows across wooden tables where ancient fragments rest under glass. 8 men sit around these tables, magnifying glasses in hand, their faces illuminated by the glow of desk lamps. They work in silence, carefully cataloging, translating, deciphering. This scene repeats day after day, year after year. The same 8 faces, the same quiet room, the same ancient secrets locked away from the world. These men called themselves the international team. The world would come to know them differently. They became the gatekeepers of humanity's most precious manuscripts, the guardians of knowledge that belonged to everyone but was shared with no one. Their monopoly would stretch across decades, turning scholarly collaboration into academic feudalism. Roland de Vaux led this scholarly brotherhood. A Dominican priest with sharp eyes and an even sharper sense of control, he understood something fundamental about power. Information withheld becomes more valuable than information shared. Each fragment he kept locked away grew in mystique, in importance, in the desperation others felt to see it. The team operated under a simple principle. Only they could read the scrolls. Only they could interpret their meaning. Only they could decide when the world was ready for what these ancient texts contained. They parceled out fragments like precious coins, doling out just enough to maintain their reputations while keeping the vast majority hidden in filing cabinets and storage boxes. Years turned into decades. Graduate students grew old, waiting for access to texts that might transform their careers. Scholars in universities across the globe submitted requests that vanished into bureaucratic silence. The scrolls had been rescued from caves in the desert only to disappear into a different kind of darkness, buried beneath layers of academic protocol and religious caution. The team justified their approach with reasonable sounding explanations. These texts required careful study. Hasty publication might lead to errors. The fragments were fragile, the translations complex. Each excuse carried enough truth to seem plausible, enough doubt to deflect criticism. But beneath these explanations lay something deeper, more troubling. Some scrolls challenged fundamental assumptions about biblical history. Others contained theological ideas that mainstream Christianity had rejected centuries ago. The longer these texts remained hidden, the less disruption they might cause to established religious doctrine. The team became unwitting servants of institutional comfort, protecting churches and synagogues from difficult questions their congregations might ask. John Strugnell inherited leadership when Duvall passed away. Where Duvall had been cautiously controlling, Strugnell proved almost possessive. He spoke of the scrolls as if they belonged to him personally, as if decades of study had granted him some kind of ownership over ancient wisdom. His interviews grew increasingly defensive, his explanations more strained. The scholarly world began to stir with frustration. Conferences buzzed with whispered complaints. Academic journals published pointed editorials questioning why these crucial texts remained inaccessible. The very scholars who should have been collaborating found themselves locked in an adversarial relationship with the team that controlled their field's most important discoveries. Meanwhile, the fragments continued their slow decay. Each passing year took its toll on the ancient parchment and papyrus. Some pieces crumbled beyond recognition while still locked away from examination. The irony was heartbreaking. Texts that had survived 2,000 years in desert caves were deteriorating in climate-controlled storage because too few eyes were allowed to study them, too few minds permitted to preserve their contents. The monopoly created a strange dynamic in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship. Knowledge became currency, access became privilege, and secrecy became standard procedure. Young researchers learned to navigate a system where progress depended not on merit or insight, but on political connections and institutional affiliations. The pursuit of truth transformed into a game of academic politics. Religious institutions watched nervously from the sidelines. The Catholic Church, having witnessed how archaeological discoveries had complicated biblical interpretation in the past, preferred the scrolls to remain in careful, controlled hands. Protestant denominations, Orthodox communities, and Jewish organizations all had reasons to appreciate the team's cautious approach. Controversy avoided was often better than truth revealed. But pressures were building that would eventually crack this scholarly fortress. Technology advanced, making photography and reproduction easier. International academic standards evolved, emphasizing collaboration over hoarding. Most importantly, a new generation of scholars emerged who refused to accept the old system's limitations. The team had created their own trap. By claiming exclusive expertise, they had made themselves indispensable. By withholding access, they had made that access incredibly valuable. By promising eventual publication, they had created expectations that grew more demanding with each passing year. The very success of their monopoly contained the seeds of its eventual destruction. Late at night, in the Rockefeller Museum, when the building fell silent and the tourists went home, those 8 scholars continued their work. They bent over their fragments, translating slowly, carefully, possessively. They had no idea that outside their controlled environment, forces were gathering that would soon tear their careful system apart. The age of academic monopoly was ending, though they didn't know it yet. The scrolls waited patiently in their storage boxes, as they had waited in their caves. But their silence would not last much longer. Code breakers and rebels. The rebellion began quietly, as most revolutions do. In university libraries and private studies, scholars who had been denied access to the scrolls began developing their own methods of investigation. They couldn't examine the original fragments, but they could study what little had been published. They could analyze photographs, compare translations, and piece together clues from fragments of information that had leaked out over the years. These academic rebels operated like intelligence analysts during wartime. gathering scattered pieces of evidence and assembling them into larger pictures. They photographed exhibition displays when the scrolls went on rare public showing. They memorized details from brief scholarly presentations. They cultivated relationships with anyone who might have glimpsed the hidden materials. Geza Vermes emerged as one of the most persistent challengers to the team's monopoly. Working at Oxford University, he possessed both the scholarly credentials to demand access and the stubbornness to keep demanding when others gave up. His requests for permission to study the scrolls were politely declined, year after year, so he changed his approach entirely. Vermes began reconstructing the scroll's contents from the outside in. He studied every published photograph with microscopic attention. He analyzed the writing styles, the dialect patterns, the theological themes that appeared in the few texts the team had released. Slowly, methodically, he built a comprehensive understanding of Qumran literature without ever touching the original manuscripts. His persistence paid off in unexpected ways. Vermes discovered that the team's published translations contained inconsistencies, gaps, and occasionally what appeared to be deliberate omissions. Passages that should have continued were cut short. References to other texts were left unexplained. The careful scholar began to suspect that important material was being withheld not for academic reasons, but for theological ones. Meanwhile, in California, a computer scientist named Ben Zion Wacholder was approaching the same problem from a completely different angle. Wacholder understood something that traditional scholars had missed. The team had published a concordance, an index of words and phrases that appeared in the unpublished scrolls. This concordance was meant to help scholars reference the hidden texts without actually reading them. But Wacholder realized that a sufficiently detailed concordance could be reverse engineered. By analyzing which words appeared together in what contexts and with what frequency, he could begin reconstructing the actual texts. It was like solving a massive jigsaw puzzle where each word was a piece and the concordance provided subtle clues about where each piece belonged. Working with his graduate student Martin Ebeg, Wacholder fed the concordance data into early computer programs designed for textual analysis. The computers processed thousands of word relationships, identifying patterns that human minds might miss. Slowly, ancient sentences began to emerge from statistical analysis. Phrases materialized from probability calculations. The scrolls were being decoded through mathematics. The team in Jerusalem watched these developments with growing alarm. Their monopoly was being undermined not by force or politics, but by ingenuity and persistence. Scholars they had dismissed as outsiders were gaining access to their jealously guarded materials through methods they hadn't anticipated. John Strugnell's response revealed the depth of the team's paranoia. He attempted to claim copyright over the concordance, arguing that Wacholder's reconstructions violated intellectual property law. The irony was stunning. Ancient texts that belonged to all humanity were being claimed as modern property by scholars who had never written them, never owned them, and had no right to control them. The legal threat backfired spectacularly. Instead of intimidating the rebels, it confirmed their suspicions that the team was hiding something significant. Why would scholars who claimed to serve truth resort to lawsuits to prevent others from studying ancient texts? The answer seemed obvious. They were protecting something beyond academic reputation. Other rebels joined the cause. Herschel Shanks, editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, began publishing articles that called out the team's secretive practices by name. He transformed what had been scholarly whispers into public accusations. His magazine reached thousands of readers who had never heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but could understand the basic injustice of hiding historical discoveries from public view. Robert Eisenman, working at California State University, took a more confrontational approach. He accused the team not just of excessive secrecy, but of deliberately suppressing materials that contradicted Christian doctrine. His theories were often controversial, sometimes speculative, but his demands for access were impossible to dismiss. He represented a new generation of scholars who refused to defer to established authority simply because it was established. The rebels discovered that their greatest weapon was persistence. The team could ignore one request, dismiss two, deflect three. but they couldn't maintain their position against sustained pressure from multiple directions. Each new challenge weakened their defenses. Each successful reconstruction of hidden texts demonstrated that their monopoly was neither necessary nor justified. Technology accelerated the rebellion's progress. Photocopying became cheaper and more accessible. Fax machines allowed instant communication between scholars on different continents. Computer databases made it possible to cross-reference enormous amounts of information quickly and accurately. The tools that could break open the team's secrecy were becoming available to anyone with sufficient motivation. The team tried to adapt, offering limited access to selected scholars in exchange for promises not to publish without permission. But these compromises only created more rebels. Scholars who glimpsed the hidden materials often discovered that they contained nothing that justified decades of secrecy. Their frustration transformed into righteous anger. By the late 1980s, the rebellion had achieved critical mass. Too many scholars knew too much about the hidden scrolls. Too many inconsistencies had been exposed in the team's explanations. Too many questions had been raised about their motives. The monopoly that had seemed unbreakable for decades was cracking along multiple fault lines simultaneously. The rebels had learned something important about power and knowledge. Monopolies survive through mystery, through the assumption that those in control possess secret wisdom that justifies their authority. But once that mystery dissolved, once ordinary scholars demonstrated they could access and understand the hidden materials, the monopoly became obviously artificial. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform Dead Sea Scroll scholarship forever. The rebels had their weapons: persistence, technology, and moral authority. The team had their defenses: institutional support, legal threats, and 40 years of precedent. But the balance of power was shifting, and everyone involved could sense that dramatic change was coming. The scrolls themselves remained patient in their storage boxes, waiting to see who would ultimately control their destiny. Scrollgate, the 1990s leak. The dam burst on September 4th, 1991. Not with explosions or dramatic confrontations, but with the quiet click of a computer printer in a university office in Claremont, California. Ben Zion Wacholder pressed the print button, and 40 years of academic monopoly collapsed in a cascade of reconstructed ancient texts. Wacholder had done the impossible. Using only the word concordance published by the team, he and his student Martin Abegg had reverse-engineered dozens of unpublished scroll fragments. Computer algorithms had succeeded where decades of polite requests had failed. The hidden texts were hidden no longer. The first reconstructed document to see daylight was called 4QMMT, a halakhic letter that appeared to be correspondence between different Jewish sects in the Second Temple period. Reading it was like discovering a 2,000-year-old argument preserved in writing. The letter revealed theological disputes that had shaped Judaism and early Christianity, debates that had been locked away in filing cabinets while scholars speculated about their contents. The Huntington Library in California provided the next shock. Librarian William Moffett announced that his institution possessed complete photographic copies of all the unpublished scroll materials. These photographs had been quietly stored in the library's archives for decades, a backup copy that the team had apparently forgotten about or chosen to ignore. Moffat's announcement created an ethical earthquake. If complete photographs already existed in a public institution, what justification remained for withholding access to the originals? The team's arguments about fragility and careful study crumbled when faced with the reality that high-quality reproductions were already available for researchers to examine. The Huntington Library opened its photo archives to qualified scholars on November 19, 1991. The date marked the end of an era. For the first time since 1947, anyone with legitimate academic credentials could study the complete corpus of Dead Sea Scroll materials. The monopoly was broken not by force or legal action, but by the simple decision to make available what should have been available all along. John Strugnell's response revealed how completely the old system was collapsing. In interviews that grew increasingly erratic, he defended the team's approach while making statements that shocked the academic world. His comments about Judaism and Jewish scholars created scandals that overshadowed the scroll controversy itself. The man who had been the scroll's primary guardian became a liability to their continued study. The Israeli Antiquities Authority, which had inherited responsibility for the scrolls from the original team, found itself forced to choose between supporting their appointed scholars and responding to international pressure. They chose pragmatism over loyalty. Strugnell was removed from his position, and Emmanuel Tov was appointed to oversee a new, more open approach to scroll publication. The floodgates opened wider. Scholars who had waited decades for access rushed to examine materials they had only dreamed of studying. Graduate students planned dissertations around texts they could finally read. Publishers competed to produce editions of the newly available materials. The scholarly world experienced something like a gold rush, with ancient texts as the precious metal being claimed. But the sudden availability created new problems. Texts that had been carefully guarded for 40 years were now being studied by dozens of scholars simultaneously. Competing interpretations emerged before definitive editions could be established. Theories proliferated faster than evidence could be evaluated. The careful, controlled scholarship that the team had promised gave way to sometimes chaotic intellectual enthusiasm. The media discovered the story and transformed it into something larger than academic politics. Newspapers and magazines wrote about forbidden gospels and suppressed secrets, often exaggerating the theological implications of texts that were interesting but hardly revolutionary. The scrolls became symbols of institutional cover-up, even when the reality was more mundane than mysterious. Religious communities watched nervously as scholars began publishing preliminary findings from the newly available materials. Some texts did indeed challenge conventional understanding of early Judaism and Christianity. Others confirmed traditional interpretations. Most fell somewhere in between, adding nuance and complexity to historical questions without providing simple answers. The Vatican issued careful statements emphasizing that Catholic doctrine was not threatened by archaeological discoveries. Protestant denominations largely ignored the controversy, trusting that their theological foundations were secure regardless of what ancient texts might contain. Jewish communities showed more interest, recognizing that these materials provided unprecedented insight into their ancestors' beliefs and practices. The legal battles that followed revealed how completely the landscape had changed. The team attempted to assert copyright over their translations and interpretations, but courts generally sided with scholars who argued for academic freedom and public access to historical materials. The principle that ancient texts belong to humanity, not to their modern interpreters, gained legal recognition. Emmanuel Tov's new publication project moved with impressive speed. What the original team had failed to accomplish in 40 years, the new international consortium completed in less than a decade. The discoveries in the Judean Desert series finally provided complete scholarly editions of all the scroll materials. The work was careful, thorough, and most importantly, available to everyone. The transformation affected more than just Dead Sea Scroll scholarship. The controversy established new expectations for how archaeological discoveries should be handled. International agreements now typically require rapid publication of findings. Scholarly communities developed stronger mechanisms for challenging excessive secrecy. The monopoly that had controlled the scrolls could never be recreated under modern academic standards. Some members of the original team adapted successfully to the new environment. Others remained bitter about losing their exclusive access to materials they had considered their personal domain. The scholarly community learned important lessons about the dangers of concentrating too much authority in too few hands, even when those hands belong to respected experts. The scrolls themselves finally began receiving the broad scholarly attention they deserved. Freed from the constraints of monopolistic control, research flourished in unexpected directions. Computer analysis revealed statistical patterns in the texts. Archaeological evidence was re-examined in light of newly available materials. Theological debates that had been theoretical became grounded in actual textual evidence. The 1990s leak transformed the Dead Sea Scrolls from jealously guarded secrets into shared scholarly resources. The change came almost overnight, decades later than it should have, but complete and irreversible. The scrolls had waited patiently through their long captivity, and they were finally free to tell their stories to the world, what they didn't want you to read. The newly liberated scrolls began speaking, and their voices carried messages that explained decades of nervous secrecy. These weren't just ancient documents gathering dust in storage boxes. They were theological dynamite, containing ideas that challenged fundamental assumptions about Judaism, Christianity, and the development of biblical religion. The community rule emerged as one of the most startling discoveries. This document outlined the beliefs and practices of the Qumran community in extraordinary detail, revealing a group that lived like early Christian monastics centuries before Jesus was born. They shared property communally, practiced ritual baptism, and celebrated sacred meals with bread and wine. The parallels to Christianity were unmistakable and deeply unsettling to scholars who had assumed these practices originated with Jesus and his followers. More disturbing was the document's dualistic theology. The community rule described a universe divided between forces of light and darkness, with humans caught in an eternal struggle between good and evil. This wasn't the nuanced monotheism of mainstream Judaism, but something closer to the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism. The implications were staggering. If Jewish groups were already embracing dualistic ideas before Christianity emerged, then Christian theology might be less revolutionary and more derivative than anyone had imagined. The Damascus document revealed even more uncomfortable truths. This text described a group called the New Covenant, led by a figure known as the Teacher of Righteousness. The teacher had been persecuted by religious authorities, particularly a figure called the Wicked Priest. He had gathered faithful followers who awaited divine vindication and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. Sound familiar? The parallels to Jesus' story were impossible to ignore, but they predated Christianity by at least a century. The teacher of righteousness had been teaching, gathering disciples, and apparently dying for his beliefs long before the Gospels claimed similar events for Jesus. Some scholars began wondering whether the Christian story was original or whether it followed a template that already existed in Jewish sectarian literature. The War Scroll presented perhaps the most alien vision of all. This document described a final battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, complete with detailed military formations, battle tactics, and divine interventions. Angels would fight alongside human warriors in a cosmic conflict that would determine the fate of the universe. The righteous would triumph, the wicked would be destroyed, and God's kingdom would be established through violence and warfare. This wasn't the peaceful, loving God of conventional Christianity or the ethical monotheism of mainstream Judaism. This was a warrior deity preparing for apocalyptic battle. The War Scroll revealed currents of Jewish thought that were militaristic, dualistic, and revolutionary. These ideas had influenced early Christianity more than anyone wanted to admit, particularly the violent imagery in the Book of Revelation. The Thanksgiving hymns provided a different kind of challenge. These beautiful poetic texts expressed profound spirituality and mystical experience, but they were written by sectarians who considered themselves the only true believers. The hymns described a community convinced of their own righteousness and certain of everyone else's damnation. They had received special revelation that guaranteed their salvation while condemning the rest of humanity to destruction. This exclusive, elitist spirituality troubled scholars who preferred to see ancient Judaism as more tolerant and inclusive. The Thanksgiving hymns revealed that sectarian groups could combine genuine religious insight with dangerous spiritual arrogance. They had created theological systems that justified hatred of outsiders as religious obligation. The Pesher texts were even more challenging. These documents interpreted biblical prophecies as references to contemporary events and figures. The authors believed that ancient scriptures contained hidden messages about their own time, their own community, and their own enemies. They read the Bible as if it were written specifically for them, with every verse containing secret meanings that only they could decode. This interpretive approach had profound implications for understanding how early Christians read their scriptures. The Gospels and Paul's letters use similar techniques, finding prophecies about Jesus in passages that originally had nothing to do with messianic figures. The Qumran texts revealed that this creative biblical interpretation was a common sectarian practice, not a uniquely Christian innovation. Some fragments contained even more explosive material. References to a pierced Messiah appeared in texts that predated Jesus by decades. Descriptions of divine figures who would suffer and die for their people echoed Christian theology but emerged from purely Jewish sources. The boundaries between Judaism and Christianity, which had seemed clear and distinct, began to blur when examined through the lens of sectarian literature. The calendar texts revealed another uncomfortable truth. The Qumran community used a different calendar from mainstream Judaism, celebrating festivals on different dates and following a solar rather than lunar year. This wasn't just a technical disagreement about astronomy. It meant that sectarian groups were celebrating Passover, Yom Kippur, and other holy days at completely different times from the temple authorities in Jerusalem. Early Christians had similar calendar conflicts with mainstream Judaism, suggesting that they might have inherited sectarian practices rather than developing them independently. The idea that Christianity emerged directly from Temple Judaism became harder to sustain when evidence suggested it might have emerged from sectarian Judaism instead. The Temple Scroll presented the most direct challenge to religious authority. This massive document contained detailed plans for rebuilding the Jerusalem temple according to divine specifications supposedly revealed to the author. But these plans contradicted the actual temple that existed in Jerusalem. The Qumran community wasn't just criticizing temple practices, they were claiming that the entire structure was wrong and needed to be replaced. This wasn't respectful disagreement with religious authorities. This was revolutionary theology that declared the established religious system illegitimate and called for its complete replacement. Similar attitudes appeared in early Christian literature, where Jesus predicts the temple's destruction and promises a new covenant that would replace the old system entirely. The newly available text painted a picture of Second Temple Judaism that was far more diverse, contentious, and revolutionary than most scholars had imagined. Multiple groups claimed exclusive access to divine truth. Various communities interpreted scripture in radically different ways. Sectarian movements combined genuine spirituality with political rebellion and social revolution. These discoveries explained why the scrolls had been kept secret for so long. They revealed that the religious world into which Christianity was born was already filled with messianic expectations, apocalyptic visions, and sectarian conflicts. Christian origins looked less miraculous and more historically predictable when viewed against this background. The scrolls hadn't revealed any single devastating secret that would destroy religious faith. Instead, they had revealed dozens of smaller truths that collectively challenged comfortable assumptions about how Judaism and Christianity had developed. The texts forced scholars to acknowledge that the ancient world was more complex, more diverse, and more interesting than simplified historical narratives had suggested. Most importantly, the scrolls had demonstrated the danger of allowing any group to control access to historical evidence. The texts themselves were fascinating and important, but they weren't so revolutionary that they needed to be hidden from scholarly examination. The real scandal wasn't what the scrolls contained, but the fact that they had been kept secret for so long. The War Scroll, God versus Evil in 7 Battles Deep in Cave 1, archaeologists discovered a scroll that read like a military manual written by angels. The War Scroll stretched across 19 columns of carefully copied Hebrew text, describing a final battle between cosmic forces of good and evil. But this wasn't abstract theology or poetic metaphor. The scroll contained detailed battle plans, weapons specifications, and tactical formations for a war that would determine the fate of the universe. The document begins with a simple declaration that transforms everything that follows. The first attack of the sons of light shall be undertaken against the forces of the sons of darkness. These weren't human armies fighting over territory or resources. These were spiritual forces engaged in ultimate conflict with the survival of righteousness itself hanging in the balance. The Sons of Light represented the Qumran community and their allies among the faithful remnant of Israel. They would be joined by angels, led by the archangel Michael, in a war against darkness that had been planned before the foundation of the world. Their enemies included not just Gentile nations, but apostate Jews who had abandoned divine law and embraced corruption. The scroll maps out 7 battles extending over 40 years. Each engagement follows carefully prescribed rituals and formations. The Sons of Light would advance carrying banners inscribed with phrases like God's truth and God's justice. Their weapons would be consecrated through elaborate purification ceremonies. Even their military formations would follow patterns that reflected divine order and cosmic harmony. The first 3 battles would end in stalemate. The Sons of Light would win some engagements, the Sons of Darkness others. This wasn't divine weakness, but divine strategy. The early conflicts would test the faithful, purify their commitment, and demonstrate that victory required more than human effort. Only when the righteous had proven their worthiness would divine intervention guarantee final triumph. The scroll describes weapons technology that blended practical military knowledge with mystical speculation. Swords would be forged according to specifications that included not just metallurgy, but spiritual principles. Shield designs would incorporate sacred geometry. Even arrows would be crafted through rituals that invested them with divine power. The war would be fought with physical weapons charged with spiritual energy. Military formations receive equally detailed attention. The scroll specifies how many troops should march in each unit, what distances they should maintain between ranks, and how they should coordinate attacks across multiple fronts. But these aren't just tactical considerations. The formations create patterns that mirror the arrangement of stars in heaven and the organization of angelic armies in the celestial realm. Priests would accompany the warriors into battle, carrying trumpets that would sound signals coordinating both human and angelic forces. The scroll provides musical notations for different battlefield situations: advancing, retreating, attacking, defending. Sacred music would unite earthly and heavenly armies in synchronized combat against the forces of darkness. The document reveals that the Qumran community expected this war to begin soon. They weren't writing speculative fiction about distant future events. They were preparing practical manuals for conflicts they believed would occur within their lifetimes. The scroll includes instructions for training regimens, weapon maintenance, and battlefield medicine. These people were getting ready for actual warfare. But the War Scroll also acknowledges that human preparation alone wouldn't ensure victory. The final battle would require direct divine intervention. God would send fire from heaven to consume the enemies of righteousness. Angels would descend to fight alongside mortal warriors. The powers of darkness would be defeated not through superior tactics, but through supernatural assistance that would tip the cosmic balance toward light. The scroll's vision of warfare combines brutality with transcendence in ways that make modern readers uncomfortable. Enemies wouldn't just be defeated, they would be annihilated. The Sons of Darkness would be blotted out from existence, erased so completely that their memory would vanish from the earth. This wasn't just military victory, it was theological genocide, justified as cosmic necessity. Yet the document also emphasizes that warriors of light must maintain ritual purity throughout the conflict. They cannot engage in warfare while spiritually contaminated. Sexual activity, contact with corpses, and various other forms of impurity would disqualify fighters from participating in sacred combat. The war would be holy in the most literal sense, requiring holiness from all participants. The War Scroll influenced early Christian apocalyptic literature in ways that scholars are still discovering. The Book of Revelation describes similar battles between cosmic forces, complete with angelic armies, divine weapons, and the ultimate triumph of good over evil. The parallels are too numerous and specific to be coincidental. Christian apocalypticism inherited sectarian Jewish visions of cosmic warfare. The scroll also reveals how sectarian groups process their frustration with political powerlessness. The Qumran community couldn't challenge Roman authority or temple corruption through conventional means. but they could imagine a future war where divine intervention would vindicate their cause and destroy their enemies. Apocalyptic literature provided psychological compensation for present weakness. More troubling is the scroll's influence on later religious movements that combined spiritual devotion with violent revolution. The vision of holy war justified by cosmic necessity has inspired countless groups throughout history to take up arms in God's name. The War Scroll demonstrates how easily religious fervor can transform into religious violence when believers become convinced that they're fighting ultimate battles between good and evil. The document forces uncomfortable questions about the relationship between spirituality and warfare. Can genuine religious experience coexist with detailed planning for the annihilation of enemies? The War Scroll suggests that it can, at least in the minds of people who believe that God has chosen them as instruments of divine justice in a corrupt world. Reading the War Scroll today, after centuries of religious warfare and ideological violence, its vision seems both ancient and disturbingly contemporary. The specific weapons and tactics are obsolete, but the underlying mentality survives, wherever groups become convinced that they possess absolute truth and their enemies represent absolute evil. The scroll reminds us that religious texts can inspire both transcendent spirituality and devastating violence, sometimes within the same document, sometimes within the same community, sometimes within the same human heart. The Sons of Light who wrote these battle plans believed they were serving the highest possible cause. Whether that belief justified their preparations for cosmic warfare remains a question that echoes through history. The Copper Scroll and the Lost Treasure. Hidden among the manuscript caves, archaeologists discovered something that didn't belong with the others. Cave 3 yielded a scroll unlike any other found at Qumran, unlike any ancient document ever discovered anywhere. Instead of parchment or papyrus, this text had been inscribed on thin sheets of copper, then rolled and stored like its more fragile companions. But when scholars finally opened it, the Copper Scroll revealed secrets that had nothing to do with theology or religious law. The scroll contained a treasure map, not a metaphorical description of spiritual wealth, but a literal inventory of gold, silver, and precious objects hidden throughout ancient Palestine. Item by item, location by location, it listed enormous quantities of wealth buried in underground chambers, sealed in jars, and hidden in places known only to the scroll's authors. The first entry sets the tone for everything that follows. In the fortress, which is in the Vale of Achor, 40 cubits under the steps entering to the east, a money chest and its contents of a weight of 17 talents. 17 talents of gold would have represented wealth beyond imagination in the ancient world, enough to fund armies or build cities. And this was just the first item on a list that continued for 64 locations. The scroll describes treasures hidden throughout Judea from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea, from familiar landmarks to secret locations that may have been known only to insiders. Underground chambers beneath well-known buildings, cisterns in abandoned settlements, caves marked by cryptic symbols. The authors had created a comprehensive network of hidden wealth scattered across the landscape. Some locations sound almost mythical in their descriptions. In the Great Cistern, which is in the courtyard of the peristyle, in the bottom of it, sealed up, opposite the upper entrance, 900 talents. 900 talents would have represented more wealth than most kingdoms possessed. The numbers strain credibility, suggesting either enormous actual treasures or exaggeration beyond all reasonable limits. The scroll uses a mixture of Hebrew and Greek script, with some words spelled in ways that suggest the authors spoke Aramaic as their primary language. The writing style is terse, practical, focused on conveying essential information rather than literary beauty. These weren't scribes creating religious literature. They were record keepers documenting hidden assets. Geographical references in the scroll pose fascinating puzzles for modern researchers. Some locations are clearly identifiable, others remain mysterious despite decades of investigation. The Valley of Achor appears in biblical literature and can be located with reasonable confidence. But what about the House of the Two Pools, or the Monument of the Three Bowls? These places may have vanished from history along with the knowledge of where the treasures were hidden. The inventory includes more than precious metals. Sacred vessels from the temple appear throughout the list, described with technical terminology that suggests intimate familiarity with religious objects. Priestly garments, ritual implements, and ceremonial items feature alongside gold and silver. This wasn't just personal wealth, it included the religious treasures of institutional Judaism. Some entries contain references that connect the scroll to wider networks of hidden wealth. In the tomb of Zadok, beneath the pillar of the exedra, 10 talents. Zadok was a priestly name associated with the Jerusalem temple, suggesting that religious authorities might have been involved in hiding these treasures. The scroll hints at organized efforts to preserve religious and material resources during times of crisis. The copper medium itself raises intriguing questions. Why inscribe a treasure inventory on expensive metal sheets instead of cheaper writing material? Copper resists decay better than parchment or papyrus, suggesting the authors expected their list to survive for centuries. They were creating a permanent record that could guide future treasure hunters to hidden wealth. Dating the scroll presents complex challenges. The copper itself cannot be carbon dated like organic materials. The script and language provide clues, but not definitive answers. Most scholars place its composition sometime during the 1st century CE, possibly during the Jewish revolt against Rome, when prudent people might have hidden valuables before fleeing or fighting. The relationship between the Copper Scroll and the other Qumran texts remains controversial. Was it produced by the same community that wrote the religious manuscripts? The treasure inventory doesn't match the sectarian literature's emphasis on poverty and spiritual purity. Communities that renounced material possessions wouldn't normally maintain detailed records of hidden wealth. Alternative theories suggest the scroll might have originated with temple authorities or wealthy Jerusalem families who used Qumran caves as convenient hiding places. The religious community might have discovered the copper scroll already hidden there, or they might have been entrusted with its preservation by allies facing persecution or exile. Modern treasure hunters have attempted to locate the scroll's hidden wealth with predictably disappointing results. The geographical landscape has changed dramatically over 2,000 years. Ancient landmarks have vanished. Place names have evolved or disappeared entirely. Even locations that can be identified precisely have been thoroughly excavated or developed beyond recognition. More sophisticated archaeological efforts have yielded equally frustrating results. Ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and systematic excavation have failed to uncover any of the treasures described in the scroll. Either the wealth was recovered long ago, or the locations have been so thoroughly altered that modern searchers cannot identify them accurately. Some scholars question whether the treasures ever existed at all. The quantities described in the scroll are so enormous that they challenge belief. Could any group have accumulated such vast wealth? Could they have hidden it so thoroughly that no trace remains? The scroll might represent wishful thinking rather than actual inventory, dreams of wealth rather than records of reality. But other evidence suggests the Copper Scroll might indeed record actual treasures. Similar treasure lists appear in later Jewish literature, particularly texts describing the hiding of temple wealth before its destruction by Roman forces. The tradition of preserving religious objects during times of persecution was well established in Jewish culture. The scroll's technical terminology supports its authenticity. The descriptions of religious vessels use specialized vocabulary that would have been familiar to temple personnel but obscure to casual observers. The geographical references, while difficult to identify today, show detailed knowledge of first-century Palestine that would be hard to fake. Recent archaeological discoveries have provided tantalizing hints that systematic treasure hiding did occur during the period when the Copper Scroll was written. Caches of coins, jewelry, and religious objects have been found throughout Israel and Palestine, usually in contexts suggesting they were hidden during times of crisis and never recovered by their owners. The scroll may represent one part of a larger preservation effort during the Jewish revolt against Rome. As Roman legions approached Jerusalem and its temple, religious authorities and wealthy families would have faced a stark choice: flee with their portable wealth or hide it and hope to return later. Many chose hiding, creating treasure caches throughout the region. The Copper Scroll's survival at Qumran might not be coincidental. The desert community could have served as a safe house for people fleeing Roman persecution. Refugees might have brought their treasure inventories along with their religious texts, storing both types of documents in the same caves for preservation during the crisis. The mystery of the Copper Scroll extends beyond its treasures to its very existence. Why did the authors create this document? Were they planning to return for the wealth themselves? Were they preserving information for future generations? Were they creating evidence for legal claims that might be needed after the crisis passed? The scroll raises profound questions about the relationship between material and spiritual wealth in ancient religious communities. Could people devoted to spiritual purity also be concerned with preserving earthly treasures? The Copper Scroll suggests that even the most otherworldly religious groups remained connected to practical concerns about survival and continuity. Modern readers often romanticize the search for lost treasure, imagining dramatic discoveries that will unlock ancient secrets. But the Copper Scroll reminds us that most treasure hunting ends in disappointment. The real wealth lies not in finding gold and silver, but in understanding the hopes, fears, and desperate calculations of people facing catastrophic change. The scroll represents a uniquely human document, a record of people trying to preserve what they valued most during times when everything they knew was being destroyed. Whether the treasures still lie hidden beneath Palestinian soil or were recovered long ago, the Copper Scroll preserves something more precious than metal, the testament of human determination to save what can be saved when the world is ending. Before Jesus, the teacher of righteousness. In the religious landscape of ancient Palestine, one figure emerges from the Dead Sea Scrolls like a shadow cast backward through time. The teacher of righteousness appears throughout the sectarian literature as a messianic leader who gathered disciples, faced persecution, and apparently died for his beliefs. His story unfolds across multiple documents, creating a narrative that seems hauntingly familiar to anyone acquainted with Christian origins. The Damascus document introduces him first, describing a time when Israel had gone astray and God's anger burned against the nation. In this spiritual darkness, divine providence raised up a teacher of righteousness to guide the faithful remnant back to proper understanding of the law. He possessed special revelation that allowed him to interpret Scripture correctly and establish a new covenant with God. This teacher wasn't just another religious reformer offering different interpretations of familiar texts. The scrolls present him as a figure of cosmic significance, chosen by God to reveal hidden truths that had been concealed from previous generations. He received direct divine inspiration that enabled him to understand prophetic writings in ways that earlier scholars had missed. The community rule describes how followers of the teacher of righteousness organized themselves into a covenant community that lived according to his teachings. They shared property communally, practiced ritual purification through water baptism, and celebrated sacred meals that commemorated their special relationship with God. These practices would seem revolutionary if they weren't so familiar to students of early Christianity. The Thanksgiving hymns, possibly written by the teacher himself, reveal a figure who experienced intense spiritual struggles and ultimate vindication through divine intervention. The hymns describe someone who faced persecution from religious authorities, endured opposition from former friends, and found refuge only in God's protection. The emotional tone suggests personal experience rather than literary convention. One hymn speaks directly to the theme of persecution. They have banished me from my land like a bird from its nest, and all my friends and familiar acquaintances have been driven far from me. The teacher's followers had been scattered, his community disrupted, his message rejected by mainstream religious authorities. Yet he maintained faith that God would ultimately vindicate his cause. The Pesher texts reveal more about the teacher's conflicts with established religious leadership. These commentaries on biblical books identify contemporary figures through coded references, describing ongoing struggles between the teacher of righteousness and his primary enemy, known as the wicked priest. This opponent appears to have been a high-ranking religious official, possibly even the high priest in Jerusalem. The conflict wasn't merely theological, but intensely personal. The wicked priest is described as someone who pursued the teacher of righteousness to swallow him up in his venomous anger. This wasn't polite disagreement between scholarly interpreters. It was bitter hostility that threatened the teacher's life and the survival of his community. Some texts suggest the teacher of righteousness met a violent end. References to his removal or gathering in appear in contexts that imply death, possibly execution at the hands of his enemies. The exact circumstances remain unclear, but the sectarian literature treats his death as a pivotal event that proved his righteousness and condemned those who opposed him. The teacher's followers believed his death wasn't final defeat, but temporary setback. They expected him to return at the end of days to judge his enemies and establish God's kingdom on earth. This hope of vindication sustained the community through persecution and exile, providing theological foundation for their continued existence as a faithful remnant. The chronological puzzle surrounding the teacher of righteousness creates fascinating implications for understanding Christian origins. Most scholars date the teacher's career to the 2nd or 1st century BCE, placing him decades or even centuries before Jesus. If these dates are accurate, then many elements of the Christian story existed in Jewish sectarian literature long before the Gospels were written. The parallels extend beyond general themes to specific details. Both the teacher and Jesus gathered small communities of devoted followers. Both faced opposition from established religious authorities. Both offered new interpretations of Scripture that claimed divine authorization. Both apparently died at the hands of their enemies. Both were expected by their followers to return in glory. The similarities raise uncomfortable questions about Christian uniqueness. Were the gospel writers familiar with sectarian literature about the teacher of righteousness? Did they consciously model Jesus' story on earlier messianic traditions? Or do the parallels reflect common patterns in how Jewish communities processed religious crisis and hope? Some scholars argue that the teacher of righteousness might have influenced early Christianity directly. If sectarian communities survived the destruction of Qumran and integrated with other Jewish groups, their traditions about the teacher could have shaped emerging Christian theology. The Baptist movement associated with John the Baptist shows striking similarities to sectarian practices and might represent one such connection. Other researchers emphasize the differences between the teacher and Jesus. The teacher appears to have been primarily a legal interpreter who offered correct understanding of biblical law. Jesus, according to Christian sources, claimed authority that transcended legal interpretation altogether. The teacher worked within sectarian Judaism. Jesus appealed to broader Jewish society and eventually to Gentile audiences. The teacher of righteousness also seems to have been a more exclusive figure than Jesus. His message was addressed specifically to the faithful remnant who could achieve the ritual purity and legal observance required for membership in the covenant community. Christian literature, by contrast, emphasizes Jesus' outreach to tax collectors, sinners, and other people who wouldn't have qualified for sectarian membership. But these differences might reflect the perspectives of later interpreters rather than the historical figures themselves. Christian sources were written by people trying to distinguish their movement from Jewish sectarianism. They had theological reasons for emphasizing Jesus' uniqueness and universal appeal. Earlier traditions might have portrayed Jesus in ways that seemed more similar to the teacher of righteousness. The question of influence becomes even more complex when considering that both figures might have drawn from common sources in Jewish messianic expectation. Ancient Judaism contained rich traditions about suffering, righteous figures who would be vindicated by God. Both the teacher of righteousness and Jesus might represent variations on these shared themes rather than one influencing the other directly. The teacher of righteousness ultimately remains an enigmatic figure whose historical significance may be impossible to determine precisely. The sectarian literature presents him through the lens of theological interpretation rather than biographical interest. His followers were more concerned with what his career meant for their community's future than with preserving accurate records of his earthly life. But his presence in the Dead Sea Scrolls serves as a powerful reminder that the religious world into which Christianity was born already contained messianic movements, sectarian communities, and theological traditions that would profoundly influence later developments. The teacher of righteousness may not have been Jesus, but he prepared the ground in which Christianity would grow. The Temple Scroll, build it and they will come. Among all the documents found at Qumran, none was more audacious than the Temple Scroll. Stretching over 28 feet when unrolled, this massive manuscript presented itself as direct divine revelation about how God's sanctuary should be constructed. But this wasn't commentary on the existing temple in Jerusalem. This was a revolutionary blueprint for replacing it entirely with a structure that would dwarf Solomon's creation and embody divine perfection in stone and gold. The scroll speaks in God's first person throughout, creating the impression that the reader is receiving direct instructions from the divine architect of the universe. You shall make the sanctuary that I will create in the midst of the land, the text begins, establishing immediately that this isn't human planning, but celestial command. Every measurement, every material, every ritual detail comes with the authority of ultimate divine revelation. The temple described in the scroll bears little resemblance to the second temple that dominated Jerusalem during the scroll's composition. Where the historical temple occupied a relatively modest space on the Temple Mount, the scroll's sanctuary would require an area roughly the size of the entire ancient city. 3 concentric squares of courts and buildings would create a sacred complex that could accommodate hundreds of thousands of worshippers during pilgrimage festivals. The innermost court would house the sanctuary building itself, constructed according to specifications that blend biblical descriptions with visionary elaboration. Gold would cover surfaces throughout the structure. Precious stones would be embedded in walls and floors according to patterns that reflected celestial harmony. The building would literally shine with divine glory, visible from miles away to anyone approaching Jerusalem. The middle court would contain facilities for the thousands of priests required to operate such a massive religious complex. Chambers for storing sacred vessels, kitchens for preparing offerings, pools for ritual purification, and quarters for priestly families would create a religious city within the larger sacred precinct. The scroll calculates precisely how many priests would be needed for each function and how they should be organized into rotating divisions. The outer court would accommodate the vast crowds expected to attend festivals in the idealized temple. Covered porticos would provide shelter for pilgrims traveling from distant lands. Separate areas would be designated for different categories of worshipers, with careful attention to maintaining ritual purity and proper hierarchy. Even Gentile visitors would have designated spaces, though at carefully maintained distances from the sacred center. The scroll's architectural vision extends beyond the temple complex itself to encompass the entire city of Jerusalem. New walls would be constructed to contain the expanded sacred precincts. Streets would be laid out according to divine geometry. Residential areas would be organized to ensure that priests lived closest to the temple, with other residents arranged in order of their religious status and ritual purity. Water systems receive elaborate attention, reflecting the scroll's obsession with ritual cleanliness. Underground channels would carry fresh water throughout the complex, ensuring constant supplies for the hundreds of daily purification ceremonies required by the expanded priesthood. Waste disposal systems would remove impurities instantly, preventing any contamination of sacred space. The scroll mandates that this new temple be built not by human initiative, but by divine command. Kings and princes would be required to contribute materials and labor. The entire nation would participate in construction as a religious obligation. Foreign nations would send tribute to support the project, acknowledging Israel's God as sovereign over all the earth. But the temple scroll wasn't just describing an idealized future building. It was making a devastating critique of the existing religious establishment in Jerusalem. By claiming direct divine authorization for a completely different sanctuary, the scroll's authors were declaring that the current temple was illegitimate, inadequate, and offensive to God. The scroll's calendar requirements made this critique even more explicit. The new temple would operate according to a solar calendar that divided the year into exactly 52 weeks of 7 days each. This calendar would ensure that festivals always fell on the same days of the week, creating perfect regularity in worship cycles. But it was completely incompatible with the lunar calendar used by the Jerusalem temple. This wasn't a minor scheduling dispute. The scroll was claiming that the Jerusalem priesthood celebrated all their festivals on wrong dates, offered sacrifices at improper times, and maintained ritual cycles that violated divine will. Every religious ceremony performed in the historical temple was rendered invalid by the scroll's alternative system. The scroll's legal sections reveal additional conflicts with established religious practice. Purity requirements are more stringent than those followed in Jerusalem. Sacrificial procedures are modified in ways that would have required retraining the entire priesthood. Marriage and divorce laws are altered to create stricter standards for religious leadership. The scroll was proposing a complete overhaul of Jewish religious life. Some requirements seem designed specifically to exclude current religious authorities from serving in the new temple. Priests with physical disabilities would be barred from service entirely, not just from certain functions. Age requirements would disqualify many current temple servants. Genealogical standards would eliminate families whose records couldn't meet heightened scrutiny. The scroll envisions a purified priesthood serving a perfected temple according to corrected laws revealed directly by God. This wasn't reform of the existing system. It was replacement with something entirely new. The authors were claiming that authentic Judaism had been corrupted by the Jerusalem establishment and could only be restored through divine intervention that would sweep away current institutions. The practical implications of the Temple Scroll were revolutionary in ways that extended far beyond architecture and ritual. If implemented, the scroll's vision would have required dismantling the existing temple, displacing the current priesthood, reorganizing Jerusalem's layout, and restructuring Jewish religious life according to sectarian principles. The scroll reveals how thoroughly some Jewish groups had rejected the religious status quo of their time. These weren't people seeking minor reforms or gradual improvements. They were revolutionaries who believed that God Himself had commanded them to replace the entire religious establishment with a purified alternative. The influence of the Temple Scroll on later Jewish and Christian thought remains debated among scholars. Some see connections to the elaborate temple visions in the book of Ezekiel and the New Jerusalem described in the book of Revelation. Others emphasize the scroll's unique character and question whether it influenced literature outside sectarian circles. But the scroll's existence demonstrates that creative theological imagination flourished in Second Temple Judaism alongside careful preservation of traditional texts. Communities that felt excluded from Jerusalem's religious establishment didn't simply accept their marginalization. They developed alternative visions of how God's people should worship, often with elaborate detail and passionate conviction. The Temple Scroll stands as a monument to religious ambition and theological audacity. Its authors didn't content themselves with criticizing existing institutions. They designed complete replacements that would embody their understanding of divine will. Whether their vision was inspired prophecy or elaborate fantasy, it represents one of the most comprehensive attempts ever made to blueprint the perfect religious society. Scrolls versus Scripture. When scholars finally gained access to the complete Dead Sea Scroll collection, they discovered something that shook the foundations of biblical studies. Among the caves at Qumran lay fragments of nearly every book in the Hebrew Bible, but these ancient copies didn't always match the standard texts that Jews and Christians had been reading for centuries. Words were different. Verses appeared in altered order. Entire passages existed in some manuscripts, but not others. The scrolls forced an uncomfortable realization. The Bible had not been transmitted unchanged through history. The Book of Samuel provided the most dramatic example of textual variation. The standard Hebrew text, known as the Masoretic text, had been carefully preserved by Jewish scribes for over 1,000 years. But the Qumran fragments of Samuel contained hundreds of differences from this traditional version. Some variations were minor spelling changes that didn't affect meaning. Others represented substantial additions or omissions that altered entire episodes. One Qumran manuscript of Samuel included a long passage about Nahash the Ammonite that had completely disappeared from the traditional Hebrew text. This wasn't a scribal error or accidental omission. The passage fit perfectly into its narrative context and was preserved in ancient Greek translations of the Bible, confirming that it had once been part of the Hebrew original. Somehow, during centuries of copying, an entire section of Scripture had vanished from the Hebrew tradition. The implications were staggering for communities that believed in biblical inerrancy. If the Bible had been perfectly preserved by divine providence, how could substantial portions have disappeared from the Hebrew text while surviving in Greek translation? If scribes had been guided by God to transmit Scripture accurately, why did ancient manuscripts contain so many variations? The book of Jeremiah presented an even more complex puzzle. The Qumran caves yielded fragments representing two distinctly different versions of this prophetic book. One version closely matched the traditional Hebrew text that appears in modern Bibles. The other version was significantly shorter, with chapters arranged in different order and many passages either abbreviated or entirely absent. This shorter version of Jeremiah wasn't a damaged or incomplete manuscript. It represented a coherent, carefully edited text that made perfect sense as it stood. Ancient Greek translators had used this shorter Hebrew version as the basis for their work, which explained why the Greek Old Testament differed so substantially from later Hebrew manuscripts in its presentation of Jeremiah's prophecies. The discovery meant that at least two different editions of Jeremiah had circulated in ancient Judaism, both apparently accepted as authentic scripture by different communities. There was no single original text that could be identified as the definitive version. Instead, the prophetic book had existed in multiple forms, each with its own textual history and interpretive tradition. Similar variations appeared throughout the biblical manuscripts found at Qumran. The book of Exodus contained alternate versions of the Ten Commandments that differed from both the traditional Hebrew text and the Samaritan version. The Psalms included compositions that weren't found in standard biblical collections, mixed together with familiar psalms in arrangements that suggested different communities had assembled their sacred songbooks according to different principles. Even more troubling for traditional views of biblical transmission were the Pesher texts that quoted scripture in forms that didn't match any known version of the biblical books. These sectarian commentaries sometimes cited passages that couldn't be found in any surviving manuscript, suggesting that additional variations had existed but hadn't been preserved in the manuscript tradition. The textual variations weren't random or chaotic. Different manuscript traditions seem to reflect the theological preferences and interpretive approaches of the communities that preserved them. The Samaritan community, which recognized only the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible as scripture, maintained versions of those books that supported their distinctive beliefs and practices. The Qumran community apparently preferred biblical texts that emphasized themes important to their sectarian theology. Their manuscripts of Isaiah and other prophetic books sometimes contained readings that supported their apocalyptic expectations and their interpretation of contemporary events as fulfillment of ancient prophecy. These discoveries revolutionized scholarly understanding of how the Bible had been transmitted through ancient Jewish communities. Instead of a single, carefully preserved text passed down unchanged through generations, the evidence revealed a complex network of manuscript traditions that had preserved biblical books in multiple versions simultaneously. The process of standardization had been gradual and incomplete. Even after Jewish authorities had apparently settled on preferred readings for most biblical books, alternative versions continued to circulate in some communities. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserved some of these alternatives, allowing modern scholars to glimpse the textual diversity that had characterized ancient Judaism. For Jewish communities, these discoveries posed theological challenges that required careful consideration. If the traditional Hebrew text had been altered through centuries of copying, could it still be regarded as divinely preserved scripture? How should variations between ancient manuscripts affect modern understanding of biblical authority and interpretation? Different Jewish movements responded to these challenges in various ways. Orthodox communities generally maintained confidence in the traditional Hebrew text while acknowledging that ancient variations had existed. Reform and conservative communities saw the textual evidence as confirmation that human interpretation had always played a role in biblical transmission and that continued interpretive flexibility was appropriate. Christian communities faced similar theological questions, complicated by their use of ancient Greek and Latin translations that often preserved readings different from the traditional Hebrew text. The Dead Sea Scrolls sometimes supported the translations against the Hebrew text, vindicating ancient Christian scholars who had argued that Greek and Latin Bibles preserved authentic readings that had been lost from Hebrew manuscripts. The scrolls also revealed how actively ancient Jewish communities had engaged with their scriptural traditions. Rather than passively preserving texts unchanged, different groups had apparently felt free to edit, abbreviate, expand, and rearrange biblical books according to their theological understanding and community needs. This discovery challenged modern assumptions about the relationship between ancient and contemporary religious communities. If ancient Jews had approached their scriptures with such interpretive freedom, perhaps modern believers could engage their biblical inheritance with similar creativity and theological responsibility. The textual variations preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls ultimately enriched rather than undermined biblical studies. By revealing the diversity that had characterized ancient manuscript traditions, the scrolls provided scholars with resources for understanding how biblical books had developed through history and how different communities had interpreted their sacred literature. Most importantly, the scrolls demonstrated that textual variation hadn't threatened the essential message of biblical literature. Despite hundreds of differences in wording, arrangement, and emphasis, the fundamental theological themes of biblical books remained consistent across manuscript traditions. The variations affected details of interpretation rather than core principles of faith. The Dead Sea Scrolls taught biblical scholars humility about their ability to reconstruct original biblical texts with complete certainty. But they also demonstrated the remarkable stability of biblical literature across centuries of transmission by communities that faced persecution, exile, and cultural transformation. The variations were significant for scholarly study, but they didn't undermine the essential reliability of biblical tradition. Echoes in Christianity. Picture the earliest followers of Jesus gathering in secret rooms. They share bread, they wash each other's feet, they speak of light battling darkness. They live together, holding all things in common. They wait for the end times. Now picture the Essenes at Qumran, 2 centuries before Christ walked the earth. They share ritual meals, they perform sacred washings. They divide the world between sons of light and sons of darkness. They live in community, sharing all possessions. They prepare for the final war between good and evil. The similarities run deeper than coincidence allows. The threads between these desert monks and early Christians weave through practices, beliefs, and sacred words that echo across the centuries. Consider the baptism ritual. John the Baptist emerges from the wilderness, calling people to cleanse themselves in flowing water. The Essenes had been performing similar washings for generations. Their manual of discipline describes daily purification rites, running water, full immersion, spiritual rebirth through liquid grace. The communion meal finds its predecessor in Qumran's sacred feasts. The community rule speaks of blessed bread and wine shared among the pure. The teacher of righteousness presides over these gatherings. Members must prove their worthiness before partaking. Sound familiar? Early Christians organized themselves into communities that mirrored Essene structures. The book of Acts describes believers sharing all possessions, no private property, no individual wealth, everything held in common for the good of all. The Damascus document from Qumran outlines an identical system written centuries earlier. The language of light and darkness permeates both traditions. John's gospel speaks of Christ as the light coming into darkness. The war scroll divides humanity between sons of light and sons of darkness. Paul writes of walking in light versus walking in darkness. The Qumran texts use nearly identical phrases. Angels play central roles in both belief systems. Early Christians expect angelic visitors and divine messengers. The Essenes chronicle detailed encounters with heavenly beings. Their texts describe Michael leading the army of light. Revelation later echoes these cosmic battles with strikingly similar imagery. The concept of a new covenant appears in both traditions. Jeremiah prophesied about God writing law on human hearts rather than stone tablets. The Essenes saw themselves as the true covenant community. Early Christians claimed this same identity. Both groups believed they were chosen remnants preparing for divine judgment. Celibacy marked both communities as different from mainstream Jewish practice. Many Essenes took vows of celibacy. Early Christian leaders like Paul praised the unmarried state. Both saw physical abstinence as spiritual purity, setting them apart from ordinary believers. The organizational structures mirror each other remarkably. The Essenes had overseers who guided community life. Early Christian churches had bishops performing similar roles. Both systems emphasized collective decision-making while maintaining clear leadership hierarchies. Biblical interpretation techniques traveled from Qumran to Christian communities. The Essenes practiced pesher, finding hidden meanings in scripture that applied to their current situation. Early Christians used identical methods, seeing Old Testament prophecies fulfilled in their contemporary events. The teacher of righteousness becomes particularly intriguing when compared to Jesus. Both figures appear as reformers, challenging religious establishment. Both gather followers in wilderness settings. Both preach moral purification and spiritual renewal. Both face opposition from temple authorities. Both leave behind communities that preserve their teachings after their physical departure. Even the calendar systems show connections. The Essenes followed a solar calendar that differed from the official temple lunar calendar. This created different dates for religious festivals. Some scholars suggest Jesus celebrated Passover according to the Essene calendar, explaining discrepancies in gospel chronology. The Dead Sea Scrolls contained fragments of previously unknown Jewish texts that later Christian writers seem to quote. The Book of Jubilees appears in Qumran libraries and influences New Testament theology. First Enoch provides background for Jude's epistle. These shared sources suggest common intellectual heritage. Martyrdom traditions connect both groups through suffering for faith. The Essenes faced persecution from religious authorities. Early Christians endured similar treatment. Both communities developed theology around righteous suffering and divine vindication. The emphasis on prophecy and end times preparation defines both movements. The Essenes calculated the timing of God's final intervention. Early Christians expected Christ's imminent return. Both lived in constant anticipation of cosmic transformation. Healing practices show remarkable parallels. The Essenes studied medicinal herbs and spiritual healing methods. Jesus and his followers performed similar healing ministries. Both traditions combined physical remedies with spiritual intervention. The preservation of sacred texts became central to both communities. The Essenes carefully copied and stored religious writings. Early Christians similarly preserved and transmitted apostolic teachings. Both saw themselves as guardians of divine revelation for future generations. Some scholars propose direct historical connections. Perhaps John the Baptist spent time among Essenes before beginning his ministry. Maybe early Christian missionaries encountered Essene communities and adopted their practices. The geographical proximity makes such contact plausible. Archaeological evidence supports these connections. Qumran artifacts include pottery similar to pieces found at early Christian sites. Architectural features at both locations show comparable community planning. The physical evidence supplements textual parallels. The Damascus document mentions a new covenant in the land of Damascus, language that Paul later uses for the Christian covenant. These shared phrases suggest either direct borrowing or common cultural sources that both traditions drew upon. Whether through direct influence or parallel development, the Essenes and early Christians walked remarkably similar spiritual paths. Both emerged from Second Temple Judaism as reform movements. Both emphasized purity, community, and preparation for divine intervention. Both left behind textual traditions that continue shaping religious thought today. The line between desert monastery and early church becomes increasingly blurred as scholars examine these connections. Perhaps Christianity inherited more from the caves of Qumran than from the temples of Jerusalem. The scrolls whisper of spiritual DNA that links these ancient communities across the centuries, suggesting that truth often travels through hidden channels rather than official ones. Rome strikes back. The scrolls posed a problem that went far beyond archaeology. They challenged the very foundations upon which religious and political power rested. Rome had spent centuries building an empire not just of roads and legions, but of ideas and beliefs. These ancient texts threatened to unravel carefully constructed narratives. Emperor Constantine had made a brilliant political calculation in the 4th century. By embracing Christianity, he unified a fractured empire under a single religious banner. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE established official doctrine. Bishops from across the Roman world gathered to decide which books belonged in the Christian Bible and which beliefs counted as orthodox. This process involved deliberate choices about what to include and what to exclude. Texts that supported imperial authority found favor. Writings that promoted radical equality or challenged social order faced rejection. The result was a carefully curated collection that served both spiritual and political purposes. The Essene Scrolls suggested a different story entirely. Here were Jewish communities that had rejected temple authority long before Christianity emerged. They practiced communal living and shared property centuries before Acts described early Christian communities doing the same. Their teacher of righteousness preceded Jesus by generations, yet taught remarkably similar principles. More troubling still, the scrolls revealed the fluid nature of Scripture itself. The biblical texts found at Qumran often differed from the standardized versions that later became canonical. Words changed. Passages appeared or disappeared. Entire stories evolved across different manuscript traditions. This fluidity undermined claims of biblical inerrancy that had become central to Christian doctrine. If the very words of Scripture could change over time, how could they represent unchanging divine truth? The implications rippled through centuries of theological certainty. Roman authorities understood these dangers intuitively. They had witnessed how alternative scriptures could fuel rebellion. The Gnostic texts of the 2nd and 3rd centuries had attracted followers who challenged Orthodox Christianity. The Montanist movement had proclaimed continuing revelation through prophetic utterances. Each alternative tradition required suppression to maintain religious unity. The strategy that emerged combined official doctrine with systematic exclusion. Church councils condemned texts that deviated from approved teachings. Heretical writings faced destruction. Communities that preserved alternative traditions found themselves persecuted as threats to public order. The process intensified after Christianity became the official Roman religion. What had once been voluntary adherence became mandatory compliance. Citizens faced pressure to conform to orthodox beliefs. Deviation carried social, economic, and sometimes physical consequences. Libraries became battlegrounds in this struggle for narrative control. Approved texts received careful copying and preservation. Disapproved writings faced deliberate neglect or active destruction. The Great Library of Alexandria, once a center of diverse learning, gradually narrowed its focus to align with imperial preferences. Monasteries played crucial roles in this filtering process. Monks copied approved texts while allowing others to decay. The scriptoriums that preserved Western learning through the Dark Ages also determined which learning would survive. Their selections shaped intellectual development for centuries. The Council of Carthage in 397 CE finalized the Christian biblical canon. This decision excluded numerous texts that had been used by various Christian communities. The Gospel of Thomas, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Apocalypse of Peter, all found themselves relegated to the category of apocryphal or heretical literature. By the medieval period, the system had become largely self-reinforcing. Scholars studied only approved texts. Theologians built arguments on sanctioned foundations. Alternative perspectives disappeared from academic discourse. The narrow range of preserved sources made alternative interpretations increasingly difficult to sustain. The Inquisition represented the ultimate development of this control system. Beginning in the 12th century, church authorities actively sought out and eliminated heretical beliefs. Books were burned. Scholars faced trial. Entire communities suffered persecution for maintaining alternative traditions. This systematic approach proved remarkably effective. By the Renaissance, most knowledge of alternative Christian traditions had vanished from European consciousness. The dominant narrative appeared to be the only narrative. Orthodox Christianity seemed to represent the natural development of apostolic teaching rather than one option among many. The printing press created new challenges for this control system. Books became cheaper and more widely available. Ideas could spread faster than authorities could suppress them. The Protestant Reformation demonstrated how quickly alternative interpretations could gain popular support when they became accessible. Religious authorities adapted by developing new strategies for managing information. Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books, attempted to control what Catholics could read. Protestant denominations developed their own mechanisms for defining acceptable doctrine and excluding dangerous ideas. Universities emerged as important gatekeepers in this process. Academic theology departments determined which sources deserved study and which could be safely ignored. Scholarly consensus became a tool for maintaining intellectual boundaries. Students learned to work within approved frameworks rather than questioning fundamental assumptions. The 19th century brought new challenges as archaeology began uncovering ancient texts that had been lost for centuries. The discovery of Codex Sinaiticus and other early biblical manuscripts revealed textual variations that scholars could no longer ignore. Academic honesty began competing with institutional loyalty. Religious institutions responded with sophisticated apologetics that acknowledged textual problems while maintaining essential doctrines. Biblical criticism emerged as a discipline that could examine Scripture scientifically while preserving faith commitments. This approach allowed scholars to engage with difficult evidence without abandoning core beliefs. The Dead Sea Scrolls represented the ultimate test of this delicate balance. Here were texts that predated Christianity, yet contained remarkably similar teachings. They revealed the diversity of Second Temple Judaism while showing the constructed nature of later orthodoxy. They demanded honest examination while threatening comfortable certainties. The initial response followed familiar patterns. Access was restricted to a small group of trusted scholars. Publication was delayed while implications were assessed. Religious authorities maintained careful oversight of research directions. The goal was to manage revelation rather than prevent it entirely. But the modern world proved more difficult to control than medieval monasteries. Scholarly communities demanded access, journalists investigated delays, public interest grew as stories of suppression spread. The old strategies of containment began failing in an age of mass communication and academic freedom. The struggle between truth and control that began with Constantine continues today, played out in university departments, religious institutions, and public forums where ancient texts meet modern questions about authority, authenticity, and the power to define spiritual truth. The Vatican and the vault, deep beneath Vatican City, in climate-controlled chambers that few will ever see, rest some of history's most sensitive documents. The Vatican's secret archives, recently renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives, contain roughly 53 miles of shelving. Somewhere in this vast collection, whispers suggest, lie materials related to the Dead Sea Scrolls that have never seen public light. The Vatican's involvement with the scrolls began almost immediately after their discovery. Father Roland de Vaux, a Dominican priest and archaeologist, became one of the original members of the international team granted access to the manuscripts. His position gave the Catholic Church unprecedented influence over how these ancient texts would be interpreted and presented to the world. Cardinal Augustin Bea, a German Jesuit who served as president of the Pontifical Biblical Institute, maintained close oversight of scroll research throughout the 1950s and 1960s. His correspondence with scroll team members reveals concerns about how certain texts might affect Catholic doctrine. Some letters hint at materials that required special handling due to their sensitive nature. The Church's official position emphasized the scroll's value for understanding the world in which Christianity emerged. Vatican scholars produced careful studies showing how Qumran texts illuminated Jewish backgrounds of New Testament writings. This approach allowed them to acknowledge the scroll's importance while maintaining traditional Christian interpretations. Behind this public stance, however, lay deeper concerns. Internal documents from the 1960s, leaked decades later, revealed debates among church officials about whether certain scroll fragments contained material that could challenge core Christian beliefs. References appear to texts describing pre-Christian messianic figures with remarkable similarities to Jesus. The Copper Scroll presented particular challenges. This unique document, inscribed on metal rather than parchment, contained what appeared to be a treasure map listing vast quantities of gold and silver hidden throughout ancient Palestine. Some researchers suggested this treasure might have belonged to the Jerusalem temple, raising questions about the economic relationships between various Jewish groups in the first century. More intriguing were fragments that seemed to describe initiation rituals and sacred meals, bearing striking resemblances to Christian sacraments. If these practices preceded Christianity by decades or centuries, they could undermine claims about the unique origins of baptism and communion. Such revelations might shake the faith of ordinary believers while providing ammunition for church critics. The Vatican's response involved careful management rather than outright suppression. Father Duval and his colleagues published selected texts while delaying others that required further study. Translation choices emphasized interpretations that supported traditional Christian understanding. Alternative readings that might prove problematic received little attention in official publications. Private correspondence between Vatican officials and scroll scholars reveals the delicate balancing act involved. The Church wanted to participate in legitimate biblical scholarship while protecting doctrinal integrity. This meant supporting research that enhanced understanding of Christian origins while discouraging investigations that might prove embarrassing or disruptive. The Pontifical Biblical Commission issued guidelines for Catholic scholars working with the scrolls. These directions emphasize the importance of interpreting ancient texts within the framework of church teaching. Scholars could pursue historical questions, but needed to remember their responsibilities as faithful Catholics when drawing theological conclusions. Some researchers chafed at these restrictions. Father Joseph Fitzmyer, a prominent American biblical scholar, later described the pressure he felt to conform his interpretations to church expectations. Others found ways to present challenging material in forms that satisfied both scholarly standards and ecclesiastical oversight. The 1970s brought increasing criticism of the scroll team's secretive methods. Journalists and outside scholars began questioning why access remained so limited after decades of study. Some pointed to Vatican influence as a factor in maintaining the monopoly over these important historical documents. Church officials responded by emphasizing their commitment to scholarly integrity. They noted that Catholic institutions had provided significant funding for scroll research and deserved appropriate recognition for their contributions. The delays in publication, they argued, reflected the careful attention necessary for such important materials rather than any desire to hide uncomfortable truths. Vatican involvement extended beyond direct participation in scroll research. The Church maintained extensive networks of relationships with museums, universities, and collectors involved in the antiquities trade. These connections provided opportunities to influence how scroll fragments were acquired, studied, and interpreted. The Israel Museum in Jerusalem, which houses many of the most important scrolls, received substantial financial support from Catholic organizations. This funding came with implicit expectations about how materials would be presented to the public. Educational programs and exhibitions reflected perspectives that aligned with traditional Christian teaching. Private collectors who acquired scroll fragments often sought authentication from Catholic scholars. The Church's reputation for careful scholarship made their endorsements valuable in the antiquities market. This position allowed Vatican-affiliated experts to influence which materials entered private collections and which became available for broader study. The rise of independent scholarship in the 1980s and 1990s challenged these traditional arrangements. Computer analysis of scroll fragments revealed patterns that earlier scholars had missed or ignored. New translation techniques suggested readings that differed significantly from published versions. The monopoly over interpretation began cracking under pressure from technological advances. The massive leak of unpublished scroll photographs in 1991 finally broke the old system of control. Scholars worldwide suddenly gained access to materials that had been restricted for decades. The Vatican found itself unable to manage the flow of information or control how texts were interpreted and presented. Internal church documents from this period, later obtained through Freedom of Information requests, show considerable anxiety about the implications of unrestricted scroll access. Officials worried that sensationalized interpretations might damage church credibility or mislead the faithful about Christian origins. The response involved a shift toward more open engagement with scroll scholarship. Vatican museums began hosting exhibitions that acknowledged the complexity of early Jewish and Christian relationships. Church scholars published articles addressing difficult questions raised by scroll texts. The strategy moved from containment to careful explanation. Today, the Vatican maintains significant collections of scroll-related materials in its archives. Researchers who gain access describe photographs of fragments that have never been published, correspondence between scholars and church officials, and internal reports analyzing the theological implications of various discoveries. Freedom of information laws and changing attitudes towards scholarly transparency have made some of these materials available to researchers. However, significant portions remain classified, particularly documents dealing with the Church's strategic responses to challenging discoveries. The full extent of Vatican involvement with the Dead Sea Scrolls may never be completely known. What seems clear is that the Church recognized early on the potential implications of these ancient texts and worked carefully to ensure that their revelation served rather than undermined traditional Christian teaching. Whether this represented responsible scholarship or inappropriate interference remains a matter of ongoing debate among historians and biblical scholars. The scrolls continue to pose questions that make religious authorities uncomfortable. They reveal the constructed nature of later orthodoxy while showing the diversity of ancient Jewish and early Christian beliefs. In a world where information travels instantly and skepticism toward authority grows daily, managing these revelations requires strategies that earlier generations of church leaders never had to contemplate. The scrolls go to war. The Six-Day War of 1967 transformed the Dead Sea Scrolls from ancient curiosities into modern political weapons. When Israeli forces captured East Jerusalem and the West Bank, they gained control not only of territory, but of history itself. The scrolls, scattered across various collections and institutions, suddenly became symbols of national identity and divine mandate. Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin had been pursuing scroll fragments through private dealers and international auction houses for years. The war gave him unprecedented opportunity to consolidate these scattered pieces under Israeli control. Within months, his team had acquired several major scroll collections that had been housed in Jordanian territory. The timing seemed almost prophetic to many Israelis. Here were Jewish texts, written by Jewish hands, returning to Jewish control after 2,000 years of exile. The scrolls appeared to validate modern Israel's claims to ancient Palestine. They provided historical roots that reached back to the Second Temple period, connecting contemporary Israelis to their ancestors in ways that transcended recent political arrangements. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol understood the propaganda value of this narrative. State ceremonies welcomed the scrolls home. Educational programs emphasized their significance for Jewish identity. Tourist sites developed around Qumran and the Israel Museum, where the Shrine of the Book displayed the most important finds to millions of visitors. The scrolls became particularly important for Christian Zionism, a movement that saw modern Israel as fulfillment of biblical prophecy. American evangelical leaders point to the discovery and recovery of these ancient texts as evidence of divine blessing on the Jewish state. Donations flowed from Christian organizations eager to support what they saw as God's plan unfolding in history. This religious enthusiasm translated into political support that proved crucial for Israeli diplomacy. When the United Nations passed resolutions critical of Israeli policies, Christian Zionist organizations mobilized their considerable resources to defend Israel's positions. The scrolls provided tangible evidence that Jews belonged in this land by divine right, not merely political arrangement. Palestinian intellectuals responded by developing counter-narratives that emphasized the multicultural history of the region. They pointed out that the Essenes who wrote the scrolls might have included ancestors of modern Palestinians as well as Jews. The texts themselves revealed diversity within ancient Judaism that undermined simple claims about continuous ethnic presence. Archaeological politics became increasingly complex as both sides claimed the scrolls for their historical narratives. Israeli scholars emphasized Jewish elements in the texts while downplaying broader cultural contexts. Palestinian researchers highlighted connections to local populations and traditions that transcended narrow ethnic categories. The international scholarly community found itself caught between these competing claims. American universities that received funding from pro-Israel donors faced pressure to support interpretations that favored Israeli positions. European institutions with significant Muslim populations encountered different expectations from their diverse constituencies. The Intifada uprisings of the 1980s and 2000s brought new dimensions to scroll politics. Palestinian protesters sometimes targeted archaeological sites as symbols of occupation and cultural appropriation. Israeli security forces responded by increasing protection for Qumran and related locations, turning historical sites into militarized zones. Some Palestinian scholars accused Israeli archaeologists of deliberately suppressing evidence that might complicate claims about Jewish continuity in the land. They pointed to delays in publishing certain fragments and suggested that materials showing cultural mixing or non-Jewish influences were being hidden or minimized. Israeli researchers responded that political considerations had never influenced their scholarly work. They noted the international composition of scroll research teams and the rigorous peer review processes that governed publication. Any delays reflected the careful attention that such important materials deserved, rather than ideological bias. The rise of settlement movements in the West Bank added another layer to these debates. Some religious settlers claimed the scrolls as validation for their presence in areas like Hebron and Bethlehem. The ancient Jewish communities described in scroll texts provided historical precedent for modern Jewish settlement throughout the biblical heartland. These claims alarmed both Palestinian residents and Israeli moderates, who feared that religious nationalism was overwhelming practical political considerations. The scrolls became symbols not just of Jewish presence, but of Jewish entitlement to the entire territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. American foreign policy toward the Middle East began incorporating scroll-related themes as Christian Zionist influence grew within the Republican Party. Political candidates spoke of fulfilling biblical prophecy through support for Israeli expansion. The ancient texts provided religious justification for contemporary geopolitical strategies. Academic conferences on scroll research became venues for subtle political advocacy. Scholars from different countries found their interpretations influenced by their nation's diplomatic positions. Funding sources shaped research priorities in ways that participants rarely acknowledged explicitly but understood implicitly. The Second Gulf War brought new attention to scroll politics as American forces occupied Iraq. Some Christian leaders suggested that military action in the Middle East was preparing the region for prophetic fulfillment. The scrolls provided evidence that God was actively working through historical events to accomplish divine purposes. Iranian leaders responded by emphasizing Islamic claims to Jerusalem and Palestine. They noted that the Dome of the Rock occupied the same Temple Mount that Jews considered sacred. The scrolls might validate ancient Jewish presence, but Islamic conquest and centuries of Muslim rule created more recent claims that carried equal moral weight. Social media transformed how scroll politics played out in public discourse. Images of ancient texts circulated alongside contemporary political messages. Hashtags linked archaeological discoveries to current events. The scrolls became memes that simplified complex historical relationships into partisan talking points. Educational curricula in both Israeli and Palestinian schools began incorporating scroll materials in ways that supported their respective national narratives. Israeli students learned about Jewish religious continuity and historical connection to the land. Palestinian students studied cultural diversity and resistance to foreign occupation throughout history. Tourism became another battlefield where scroll politics played out. Competing tour guides offered radically different interpretations of the same archaeological sites. Christian pilgrims heard stories of biblical fulfillment, while secular visitors learned about scientific archaeology. The same physical evidence supported multiple incompatible narratives. The Trump administration's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital brought renewed attention to scroll-related claims about Jewish historical presence. Evangelical supporters celebrated what they saw as American alignment with biblical truth. Critics worried about the political manipulation of ancient texts for contemporary diplomatic purposes. Today, the scrolls remain entangled in Middle Eastern politics in ways their ancient authors never could have imagined. These texts that once called for separation from worldly concerns now serve worldly concerns in the most direct ways possible. They provide ammunition for competing claims about land, identity, and divine favor that shape one of the world's most enduring conflicts. The transformation of scholarship into propaganda represents one of the most troubling aspects of scroll politics. Ancient texts that should illuminate history instead obscure it beneath layers of contemporary ideology. Truth becomes secondary to usefulness in supporting predetermined conclusions about modern political arrangements. Whether the scrolls will ever escape their political captivity remains uncertain. As long as competing groups see them as validation for incompatible claims, these ancient voices will continue serving modern masters rather than speaking their own truths about the complex realities of life in ancient Palestine. Forgery, fraud, and the fake scrolls. The phone call came on a quiet Tuesday morning in 2013. Steve Green, heir to the Hobby Lobby fortune and passionate collector of biblical artifacts, listened as antiquities dealers described fragments that could revolutionize scroll scholarship. The pieces appeared to be previously unknown Dead Sea Scroll texts, available for purchase at prices that reflected their extraordinary significance. Green had been building what would become the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. His collection already included thousands of biblical manuscripts, tablets, and artifacts acquired from dealers around the world. The opportunity to add genuine Dead Sea Scroll fragments to his holdings represented the ultimate prize for a collector devoted to preserving biblical heritage. The fragments looked convincing to initial examination. They bore the characteristic writing style of ancient Hebrew scribes. The parchment showed appropriate aging and wear patterns. Chemical analysis suggested materials consistent with first-century origins. Carbon dating produced results that fell within expected ranges for Qumran texts. Green's team consulted with respected scholars who confirmed the apparent authenticity of several pieces. These experts noted similarities to known scroll texts while identifying unique variations that suggested previously unknown compositions. The fragments seemed to fill gaps in existing knowledge about Essene beliefs and practices. The acquisition process required careful negotiation with dealers who claimed the fragments had been in private collections since before 1970, when international laws governing antiquities trade became more restrictive. Provenance documentation appeared complete, though somewhat sparse in details about earlier ownership history. Payment involved millions of dollars transferred through complex networks of shell companies and offshore accounts. This elaborate financial structure, dealers explained, protected the privacy of previous owners while ensuring legal compliance with various national and international regulations governing cultural heritage transactions. The Museum of the Bible opened in 2017 with great fanfare, featuring the newly acquired scroll fragments as centerpieces of its collection. Visitors marveled at these ancient texts that connected them directly to the world of biblical times. Educational programs emphasize the fragments' importance for understanding Jewish and early Christian history. Academic scholars requested access to study the fragments more thoroughly. Initial publications described their contents and suggested implications for scroll scholarship. Conferences featured presentations about discoveries that seemed to expand knowledge about Qumran community life and beliefs. However, doubts began emerging as more researchers examined the materials. The German Federal Institute for Materials Research and Testing conducted sophisticated analysis that revealed troubling inconsistencies. The parchment showed artificial aging techniques rather than natural deterioration patterns expected from genuine ancient materials. Microscopic examination revealed modern adhesives and binding agents that had not existed in ancient times. Ink analysis showed chemical compositions that included synthetic compounds developed in the 20th century. Carbon dating results, upon closer scrutiny, appeared to have been manipulated through chemical treatments designed to produce false age readings. The writing itself contained linguistic anachronisms that native Hebrew speakers recognized as modern constructions. Grammatical patterns reflected contemporary rather than ancient usage. Theological concepts appeared to blend authentic Qumran ideas with later Jewish and Christian developments in ways that suggested modern synthesis rather than ancient composition. Digital imaging techniques revealed underlying layers that showed how forgers had created the fragments. Modern parchment had been artificially aged through chemical processes. Ancient Hebrew characters had been traced over using inks designed to mimic historical compositions. The entire fabrication process became visible under advanced technological analysis. The scandal broke publicly in 2018 when multiple scholarly institutions simultaneously announced their conclusions about the forgeries. The Museum of the Bible faced the embarrassing revelation that its prize scroll fragments were elaborate fakes created by sophisticated criminal networks that had deceived collectors and scholars worldwide. Investigation revealed a complex operation centered in modern-day Palestine, where skilled craftsmen had developed techniques for creating convincing biblical forgeries. These workshops employed traditional materials and methods combined with modern chemistry to produce artifacts that could fool initial examinations by even experienced scholars. The forgers had studied authentic scroll fragments intensively, learning to replicate writing styles, material properties, and aging patterns that characterized genuine ancient texts. They developed chemical processes for artificially aging parchment and creating patina effects that suggested centuries of natural deterioration. Market demand for biblical artifacts had created economic incentives that made forgery extremely profitable. Wealthy collectors eager to own pieces of biblical history were willing to pay enormous sums for authentic appearing materials. The combination of high prices and limited supply made fraud almost inevitable. The authentication process itself had become compromised by conflicts of interest and inadequate scientific analysis. Scholars who stood to benefit from new discoveries sometimes proved less skeptical than rigorous examination required. Dealers who earned commissions on sales had obvious incentives to confirm authenticity rather than question it. Legal investigations revealed that the forgery network had been operating for decades, producing fake artifacts from multiple ancient civilizations. Dead Sea Scroll fragments represented just one product line in an operation that also created false Egyptian papyri, Mesopotamian tablets, and classical inscriptions for collectors worldwide. The sophistication of modern forgery techniques poses ongoing challenges for authentication processes. Chemical analysis that once seemed definitive can now be defeated by countermeasures developed specifically to fool scientific testing. Carbon dating can be manipulated through treatments that alter apparent age readings. Digital technology adds new dimensions to the forgery problem. High-resolution scanning allows forgers to study authentic texts in unprecedented detail. Computer analysis of ancient writing patterns enables them to replicate individual scribal hands with remarkable accuracy. Three-dimensional printing permits creation of artifacts that replicate not just surface appearance but physical structure. The psychological aspects of forgery success reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and scholarly objectivity. People want to believe in extraordinary discoveries that confirm their pre-existing beliefs. Collectors desire unique possessions that set them apart from others. Scholars seek fame through association with revolutionary findings. These desires create cognitive biases that forgers exploit systematically. Authentication becomes less rigorous when potential buyers desperately want materials to be genuine. Red flags get ignored or rationalized away when financial and emotional investments have already been made in particular outcomes. The Museum of the Bible responded to the forgery revelations by implementing more rigorous authentication procedures and working with law enforcement to investigate the criminal networks involved. However, damage to the institution's credibility proved lasting, raising questions about the reliability of other items in its collection. The scandal illuminated broader problems within the antiquities market, where legal and ethical standards vary widely across different jurisdictions. Objects move through complex chains of ownership that obscure their origins and make authentication difficult. Collectors and dealers operate in gray areas where legal ownership and historical accuracy both remain questionable. Academic institutions face pressures that compromise their ability to serve as objective arbiters of authenticity. Funding from wealthy donors creates conflicts of interest when those same donors seek validation for their collections. Career advancement can depend on maintaining relationships with collectors and dealers who control access to important materials. The technological arms race between forgers and authenticators continues escalating as both sides develop more sophisticated tools and techniques. New methods for detecting fraud emerge regularly, but criminals adapt their approaches to defeat the latest authentication technologies. The battle between deception and detection shows no signs of resolution. Public trust in archaeological and biblical scholarship has suffered as forgery scandals multiply. When experts can be fooled by fake artifacts, ordinary people lose confidence in professional claims about ancient history. Skepticism extends beyond specific discoveries to question the entire enterprise of using material evidence to understand the past. The Dead Sea Scroll forgeries represent more than simple criminal fraud. They reveal the complex relationships between faith, scholarship, commerce, and truth in contemporary culture. When ancient texts become commodities to be bought and sold, their meaning becomes secondary to their market value. Truth itself becomes just another product competing for consumer attention in a marketplace where authenticity is increasingly difficult to determine and even harder to preserve. Who owns the past? The question seems simple enough until you try to answer it. In storage rooms across Jerusalem, fragments of ancient parchment rest in climate-controlled cases, each piece potentially worth millions on the antiquities market. Some bear Israeli museum labels. Others display American university markings. A few show private collector tags. But who actually owns these pieces of history? The Bedouin shepherds who first discovered the scrolls in 1947 followed ancient customs about found objects. In their culture, treasure discovered in caves belonged to whoever found it. They sold their discoveries to antiquities dealers in Bethlehem, beginning a chain of transactions that would span decades and cross multiple continents. Khalil Eskander Shahin, known as Kondo, became the primary middleman in these early transactions. His antiquity shop in Bethlehem served as headquarters for a network that connected Bedouin finders with international collectors. Money changed hands in back rooms while priceless manuscripts moved through channels that respected profit more than provenance. The Jordanian Department of Antiquities claimed legal authority over archaeological discoveries within its territory. Officials argued that the scrolls belonged to the state regardless of who found them or where they were subsequently sold. This position aligned with modern archaeological principles that treat cultural heritage as public property rather than private commodity. Israeli conquest of the West Bank in 1967 complicated these ownership claims considerably. The new occupying power inherited responsibility for protecting archaeological sites while gaining access to materials that had been beyond their reach. Previous Jordanian claims suddenly carried less legal weight than Israeli administrative control. Palestinian residents of the region advanced their own claims based on continuous presence in the area. They argued that artifacts found in their ancestral lands belonged to them regardless of which government currently exercised political control. The scrolls represented part of their cultural heritage that had been appropriated by outsiders. American institutions entered the ownership debate through purchasing agreements with various dealers and collectors. Universities and museums argued that their acquisitions were legitimate under international law as it existed at the time of purchase. They emphasized their role in preserving and studying materials that might otherwise have been lost or destroyed. The Vatican's involvement added another layer of complexity to ownership questions. Church officials claimed that their scholarly contributions to scroll research gave them special rights to continued access and influence over how materials were studied and interpreted. Religious authority competed with national sovereignty in determining who could make decisions about these texts. Legal battles erupted regularly as different parties pressed their claims through various court systems. Jordanian laws conflicted with Israeli regulations. American courts applied different standards than European tribunals. International conventions proved inadequate for resolving disputes that involved multiple jurisdictions and competing legal traditions. The practical result was a patchwork of ownership arrangements that satisfied no one completely, while creating ongoing uncertainty about the legal status of many fragments. Some pieces changed hands multiple times as court decisions shifted the balance between different claimants. Others remained in legal limbo for decades while litigation proceeded. Academic access became hostage to these ownership disputes. Scholars who wanted to study particular fragments had to navigate complex permission processes that involved multiple institutions and authorities. Research projects stalled while administrators argued over jurisdiction and control. The UNESCO Convention of 1970 attempted to establish international standards for cultural property protection. This agreement required member nations to prevent illegal export of archaeological materials and return objects that had been illegally removed from other countries. However, the convention applied only to future transactions, leaving existing ownership claims unresolved. Private collectors found themselves in particularly vulnerable positions as legal standards evolved. Materials that had been purchased legally under older regulations suddenly faced challenges under newer, more restrictive laws. Collectors who had spent fortunes acquiring pieces discovered that their ownership rights were less secure than they had believed. The rise of indigenous rights movements worldwide influenced discussions about scroll ownership. Native peoples in various countries successfully reclaimed cultural artifacts from museums and private collections. These precedents encouraged Palestinian advocates to press similar claims about materials found in their traditional territories. Economic considerations complicated moral arguments about rightful ownership. The scrolls had generated millions of dollars in revenue through museum admissions, book sales, documentary rights, and tourism. Various parties claimed shares of these profits based on their contributions to preservation, research, or public education. Insurance companies became unwilling participants in ownership disputes when their policies covered scroll fragments whose legal status remained uncertain. Claims for theft, damage, or loss required clear proof of ownership that many holders could not provide. Some valuable pieces became effectively uninsurable due to clouded title issues. The internet age brought new dimensions to ownership debates as digital copies of scroll images circulated freely online. High-resolution photographs allowed scholars worldwide to study texts without accessing physical materials. This democratization of information challenged traditional gatekeeping roles while raising questions about intellectual property rights in ancient texts. Forgery scandals further complicated ownership questions by revealing how easily authentication could be manipulated. When experts could be fooled by fake materials, how could anyone be certain about the legitimacy of ownership claims? The discovery of elaborate fraud networks cast doubt on the entire antiquities market. Museum ethics evolved to require more rigorous provenance research before acquiring archaeological materials. Institutions that had once accepted dealers' word about legal ownership began demanding detailed documentation of objects' histories. Many scroll fragments failed to meet these higher standards for legitimate acquisition. The emergence of digital humanities created new possibilities for collaborative ownership models. Rather than arguing over who controlled physical objects, scholars began exploring ways to share access to digital resources. Virtual museums allowed multiple institutions to display the same materials simultaneously without ownership disputes. Repatriation movements gained momentum as formerly colonized peoples demanded return of cultural heritage from Western museums. The British Museum faced pressure to return the Elgin marbles to Greece. Egyptian authorities sought return of artifacts from European collections. These precedents encouraged similar claims about Dead Sea Scroll materials. Legal scholars proposed new frameworks for managing cultural heritage that emphasized stewardship rather than ownership. Under these models, institutions would hold materials in trust for humanity rather than claiming absolute property rights. Guardianship would carry responsibilities as well as privileges. Climate change added urgency to preservation questions that transcended ownership disputes. Rising sea levels threatened coastal archaeological sites, while extreme weather endangered artifact storage facilities. The need for secure long term preservation created practical arguments for centralized control regardless of legal ownership claims. International cooperation became essential for comprehensive scroll research, as fragments remained scattered across multiple collections. Collaborative projects required agreements between institutions with competing ownership claims. Scientific progress increasingly depended on diplomatic solutions to legal and political problems. Development of blockchain technology offered potential solutions for tracking provenance and managing shared ownership of cultural artifacts. Digital certificates could create tamper-proof records of objects' histories while enabling multiple parties to hold partial ownership stakes in the same items. Young scholars entering the field found themselves inheriting ownership disputes that had been ongoing for decades. Career advancement depended on gaining access to materials whose legal status remained uncertain. The next generation of researchers faced institutional barriers created by their predecessors' inability to resolve fundamental questions about who controlled these ancient texts. Public opinion surveys revealed that most people believed archaeological discoveries should belong to all humanity, rather than individual nations, institutions, or collectors. However, translating this idealistic vision into practical policies proved challenging when real money and institutional prestige were at stake. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the vulnerability of distributed collections when travel restrictions prevented scholars from accessing materials housed in distant institutions. Digital alternatives became more important while physical access became more difficult. The crisis accelerated trends toward virtual collaboration that might eventually make ownership questions less relevant. Today, ownership of Dead Sea Scroll materials remains a complex web of competing claims, legal uncertainties, and practical compromises. No single authority controls all the fragments. No clear legal framework governs all the disputes. The scrolls exist in a state of perpetual negotiation between parties who must cooperate to study them while disagreeing about who ultimately owns them. Perhaps the question itself reflects modern assumptions that ancient peoples would not have shared. The Essenes who created these texts lived in communities where individual ownership was subordinated to collective needs. They might have been puzzled by contemporary arguments over who controls their words. The scrolls belong to the past, but the past belongs to everyone and no one. These ancient voices speak across centuries to anyone willing to listen. Their message transcends the boundaries that modern people draw around intellectual and cultural property. In the end, the scrolls may own us more than we own them, shaping our understanding of history, faith, and human nature in ways that legal document can capture or control. The digital resurrection. In a basement laboratory at Hebrew University, technicians wearing white gloves positioned fragments of ancient parchment under sophisticated imaging equipment. Multiple cameras capture every detail from different angles, while specialized lighting reveals text that human eyes cannot see. The Dead Sea Scrolls are experiencing their second life in digital form. The transformation began in the 1990s when computer technology finally became sophisticated enough to handle the complex challenges of photographing extremely fragile materials. Traditional photography had damaged some fragments through heat and chemical exposure. Digital methods promised preservation without further harm to the originals. The Israel Antiquities Authority partnered with Google to create the most comprehensive digital archive of scroll materials ever attempted. High-resolution cameras gives at resolutions far exceeding human visual capability. Every crack, stain, and faded character became visible in ways that previous generations of scholars could never have achieved. Infrared imaging revealed text that had become invisible to normal light. Letters that scribes had erased and rewritten centuries ago suddenly became readable again. Fragments that appeared blank under regular illumination showed ghostly traces of words when viewed through different portions of the electromagnetic spectrum. Advanced computer algorithms began reassembling scattered fragments based on patterns of damage, writing style, and material composition. Pieces that had been separated for decades were digitally reunited, allowing scholars to reconstruct complete texts from fragments housed in different institutions across multiple continents. The online publication of scroll images democratized access in unprecedented ways. Scholars in remote locations could examine materials with the same detail as researchers physically present in Jerusalem. Graduate students gained access to primary sources that had been restricted to senior professors. The monopoly over scroll scholarship finally cracked under digital pressure. Machine learning systems trained on thousands of ancient Hebrew characters began assisting with transcription and translation. Computers could identify damaged letters by comparing them with intact examples from similar contexts. Software filled gaps in broken text by predicting likely words based on linguistic patterns and historical context. Virtual reality applications allowed users to explore reconstructed Qumran as it might have appeared during the scroll writing period. Digital archaeologists recreated buildings, furniture, and daily activities based on archaeological evidence. Visitors could walk through the ancient community while reading the texts its members had produced. Three-dimensional scanning captured the physical structure of scroll materials in microscopic detail. These scans revealed information about how parchments were prepared, how inks were applied, and how documents were stored and handled over time. Material science merged with textual analysis to create more complete understanding of ancient scribal practices. Crowdsourcing projects enlisted volunteers worldwide to help transcribe and translate scroll materials. Amateur enthusiasts contributed alongside professional scholars, accelerating the pace of research while introducing fresh perspectives from people outside traditional academic circles. Digital collaboration broke down barriers that had limited participation for decades. Social media platforms became venues for scholarly debate about scroll interpretation. Twitter threads dissected translation choices, while Facebook groups discussed theological implications of newly revealed texts. Academic discourse escaped university confines to engage broader public audiences interested in ancient history and religious studies. Digital preservation created new challenges alongside new opportunities. File formats that seemed permanent might become obsolete within decades. Cloud storage services might disappear or change their policies. The digital copies that promised eternal preservation faced their own forms of decay and loss. Artificial intelligence systems began generating insights that human scholars had missed after decades of study. Pattern recognition algorithms identified recurring phrases across different texts, revealing connections that manual analysis had overlooked. Computer assistance accelerated research while raising questions about the role of human interpretation in understanding ancient materials. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated digital trends when travel restrictions prevented scholars from accessing physical collections. Video conferences replaced in-person collaboration, while shared digital platforms enabled research to continue despite locked borders. The crisis demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of purely virtual scholarship. Blockchain technology offered potential solutions for ensuring the authenticity and integrity of digital scroll images. Cryptographic signatures could prevent tampering while creating permanent records of who had accessed or modified files. Digital certificates might eventually become more reliable than physical provenance for establishing authenticity. Deep learning systems trained on scroll texts began generating predictions about missing portions of damaged manuscripts. These computer-generated reconstructions required careful validation by human experts, but they provided starting points for scholarly investigation that might otherwise have remained impossible. Virtual museum exhibitions reached global audiences that could never have visited physical collections. Interactive displays allowed users to manipulate images, compare different manuscripts, and explore historical contexts through multimedia presentations. Digital curation created new forms of public engagement with ancient materials. However, the digital revolution also introduced new forms of inequality. Scholars at well-funded institutions gained access to sophisticated tools while researchers in developing countries remained excluded by technological barriers. Digital divides replicated and sometimes amplified existing disparities in academic resources. The ease of digital manipulation raised concerns about scholarly integrity and public confusion. Images could be altered without obvious traces of modification. Fake materials could be presented alongside authentic ones in online collections. The democratization of access came with increased responsibility for verification and authentication. Commercial interests began influencing digital preservation priorities as technology companies sought profitable applications for their innovations. The tools that enabled scholarly research also served marketing goals and data collection strategies. Academic freedom intersected with corporate agendas in ways that created both opportunities and ethical dilemmas. Educational applications transformed how students engaged with ancient texts. Interactive timelines connected scroll materials with broader historical contexts. Translation exercises allowed learners to work directly with primary sources rather than relying solely on published interpretations. Digital tools made ancient languages more accessible to contemporary audiences. The proliferation of digital copies raised new questions about intellectual property and scholarly citation. When multiple institutions hosted the same materials online, which version should researchers reference? How should scholars acknowledge the technological infrastructure that made their work possible? Traditional academic conventions struggled to adapt to digital realities. Mobile applications brought scroll materials to smartphones and tablets, allowing casual browsing of ancient texts during commutes or leisure time. Pop-up notifications could alert users to new discoveries or interpretations. Ancient wisdom became as accessible as social media updates, though not necessarily with the same attention or respect. Gaming applications incorporated scroll materials into interactive historical simulations. Players could roleplay as ancient scribes or modern archaeologists while learning about Qumran community life. Entertainment and education merged in ways that reached audiences who might never visit traditional museums or attend academic lectures. The long-term sustainability of digital preservation remains uncertain. Storage costs continue falling, while processing power grows exponentially. However, institutional commitments to maintaining digital collections compete with other priorities for limited resources. Future generations may discover that our digital permanence was more fragile than we assumed. Today, the Dead Sea Scrolls exist simultaneously in multiple forms across various digital platforms. Their ancient words appear on screens worldwide while their physical remains rest in climate-controlled storage. This multiplication creates new possibilities for understanding while raising fundamental questions about the relationship between original and copy, between material artifact and digital representation. The scrolls have become truly immortal in ways their creators never imagined. Unlike physical parchment that inevitably decays, digital copies can theoretically last forever with proper maintenance and migration to new formats. The voices from Qumran now speak through fiber optic cables and wireless networks, reaching audiences that span the globe. Yet, something may be lost in this digital translation. The physical presence of ancient materials carries emotional and spiritual weight that no screen can fully replicate. The texture of parchment, the smell of age, the fragility that demands reverent handling. These sensory experiences connect us to the past in ways that transcend mere information transfer. The digital resurrection of the Dead Sea Scrolls represents both triumph and tragedy of our technological age. We can preserve and share these materials with unprecedented effectiveness, while potentially losing something essential about their nature as physical objects created by human hands in ancient times. The scrolls live on, but in forms their authors never could have conceived. The Dead Sea Gospel. Imagine a world where the Dead Sea Scrolls had never been hidden. Picture the teacher of righteousness walking beside Jesus through the pages of the New Testament. Envision churches built around the War Scroll instead of the Book of Revelation. What would Christianity look like if these desert voices had shaped its formation rather than challenging it from archaeological silence? The Church of the Scrolls would have emerged from very different theological soil. Instead of emphasizing individual salvation through faith, it might have focused on community purification and collective preparation for divine judgment. The Essene emphasis on ritual washing would have made baptism a daily practice rather than a one-time event. Christians would gather at dawn for repeated immersions in flowing water. Communion would carry darker undertones in this alternative Christianity. The sacred meals described in Qumran texts involve strict purity requirements and elaborate hierarchies. Only the spiritually perfect could participate fully. Others watched from the margins, working toward eventual inclusion through gradual purification. The egalitarian vision of Paul's letters would never have emerged. The concept of priesthood would have evolved differently if scroll texts had influenced early Christian development. The Essenes rejected the temple priesthood as corrupt, while maintaining their own alternative hierarchy. A scroll-influenced Christianity might have developed competing religious authorities that challenged state-sanctioned churches. Reformation would have come centuries earlier. Apocalyptic thinking would dominate theological discourse in ways that surpass even medieval Christianity's obsession with end times. The War Scrolls' detailed descriptions of final battles between light and darkness would provide roadmaps for understanding contemporary conflicts. Every political crisis would be interpreted through cosmic frameworks of ultimate spiritual warfare. Angels would play much more prominent roles in daily religious life. The scroll texts describe ongoing interactions between human and heavenly communities. Ordinary believers would expect regular angelic encounters rather than viewing them as extraordinary events. Prayer would involve direct communication with named celestial beings who govern specific aspects of earthly existence. The calendar would follow solar rather than lunar patterns, creating a Christian year that differed significantly from both Jewish and Roman systems. Religious festivals would occur on different dates, potentially preventing the syncretism that allowed Christianity to adapt to various cultural contexts. Missionary expansion might have been more difficult. Biblical interpretation would emphasize hidden meanings and contemporary applications rather than historical contexts. The Pesher method used at Qumran found current events predicted in ancient prophecies. Every biblical passage would carry multiple layers of meaning that connected scriptural words to immediate circumstances facing the community. Gender roles might have developed along more restrictive lines if scroll influences had shaped early Christianity. The Essenes practiced celibacy and maintained strict separation between men and women in many aspects of community life. The relatively egalitarian elements in some New Testament texts might never have emerged. Economic arrangements would likely have emphasized communal property and shared resources more strongly than historical Christianity ever achieved. The scroll communities practiced radical economic equality that surpassed even monastic movements. Private wealth would be viewed as spiritual corruption rather than divine blessing. Relationship with political authority would have been consistently oppositional rather than accommodating. The Essenes rejected both Roman rule and Jewish religious establishment. A scroll-influenced Christianity would never have achieved the imperial endorsement that Constantine provided. It would have remained a countercultural movement. The development of Christian doctrine would have followed different paths if scroll texts had been available to early theologians. The complex angelology and dualistic cosmology of Qumran would have influenced discussions about the nature of Christ and the Trinity. Theological controversies would have centered on different questions. Martyrdom traditions would have been less prominent if scroll influences had shaped Christian attitudes toward persecution. The Essenes withdrew from society rather than confronting it directly. Christian responses to Roman persecution might have emphasized escape rather than witness through suffering. The relationship between Christianity and Judaism would have been even more complex if scroll texts had been widely known. The Essenes represented a form of Judaism that rejected mainstream temple worship while maintaining strict adherence to divine law. Christian claims about fulfilling or replacing Judaism would have faced stronger counter-arguments. Monasticism would have emerged much earlier and in different forms if scroll communities had provided visible models for Christian imitation. The detailed regulations for community life found in scroll texts would have influenced monastic rules centuries before Benedict or Augustine developed their systems. Art and architecture would reflect different theological emphases if scroll imagery had influenced Christian visual culture. Instead of crosses and fish symbols, churches might display imagery of light battling darkness, angels in cosmic warfare, or ritual purification scenes. The aesthetic sensibility would be more austere and symbolic. Music and liturgy would have developed around different themes if scroll texts had provided source material for Christian worship. The Thanksgiving hymns found at Qumran emphasize divine predestination and human unworthiness in ways that would have created very different hymnological traditions. The role of women in this alternative Christianity remains uncertain because scroll texts reveal contradictory evidence about Essene attitudes toward gender. Some passages suggest complete exclusion, while others imply more complex arrangements. The ambiguity might have led to ongoing controversies about women's participation in religious life. Missionary strategies would have emphasized withdrawal and purification rather than engagement and conversion. The Essene model involved creating separated communities that served as examples of righteous living. Evangelism would focus on attracting the spiritually elite rather than appealing to the masses. Biblical canon formation would have proceeded differently if scroll texts had been available to early church councils. Some of the non-canonical books found at Qumran might have achieved scriptural status, while others currently in the Bible might have been excluded. The shape of Christian scripture would be fundamentally different. The relationship between faith and reason would have developed along different lines if scroll influences had shaped early Christian intellectual development. The Essene emphasis on revealed knowledge and predetermined divine plans would have created different approaches to philosophy and natural science. Social justice concerns would have been framed in terms of cosmic dualism rather than human equality. The scroll texts view poverty and oppression as manifestations of cosmic evil rather than correctable social problems. Reform movements would have emphasized spiritual purification rather than structural change. This alternative Christianity would face its own crises and adaptations as historical circumstances changed. The rigid purity requirements that worked for small desert communities might prove unworkable for large urban populations. The exclusive attitudes that maintained group identity might prevent successful expansion. The Protestant Reformation might never have occurred if scroll-influenced Christianity had already incorporated the sectarian tendencies that drove medieval reform movements. Alternatively, Reformation might have happened continuously as different groups claimed authentic interpretation of scroll teachings. Modern encounters with scientific discovery and historical criticism would create different challenges for a scroll-based Christianity. The archaeological recovery of the actual scrolls would raise questions about how accurately later traditions had preserved original teachings. The same historical methods that challenge biblical inerrancy would apply to scroll interpretation. Today's world offers glimpses of what scroll-influenced Christianity might have produced. Some contemporary movements emphasize community living, ritual purity, and apocalyptic expectation in ways that echo Qumran practices. These groups provide partial models for understanding how different early Christian development might have been. The Dead Sea Gospel remains forever hypothetical, but its implications illuminate the contingent nature of historical Christianity. The religion that conquered Rome and shaped Western civilization emerged from particular circumstances and choices that might have been different. The scrolls remind us that other paths were possible, other voices existed, and the triumph of orthodoxy was never inevitable. In the end, this alternative Christianity would have been neither better nor worse than historical Christianity, simply different. It would have produced its own saints and sinners, its own wisdom and blindness, its own contributions to human flourishing and human suffering. The scrolls show us not what should have been, but what could have been, expanding our understanding of the roads not taken in the journey of faith. Truth, heresy, and the human need to know. Sarah Chen stares at her computer screen at 2 a.m., scrolling through digital images of scroll fragments that most people will never see. She's a graduate student who discovered these materials through leaked databases that academics whisper about in conference hallways. The texts challenge everything her professors taught her about early Christianity. She faces a choice that scholars have confronted for decades: publish the truth and risk her career, or stay silent and preserve her future. This dilemma captures something fundamental about human nature that the Dead Sea Scrolls have exposed with uncomfortable clarity. We claim to want truth, but we often prefer comfortable lies. We celebrate brave truth tellers in retrospect while punishing them in real time. The scrolls have become a lens through which we can examine our complicated relationship with knowledge itself. The pattern appears throughout scroll history. Scholars who questioned traditional interpretations found themselves marginalized or excluded from research opportunities. Academic careers depended on maintaining relationships with institutions that preferred certain conclusions over others. Truth became secondary to professional survival. Religious communities faced similar tensions when scroll discoveries challenged cherished beliefs. Congregations wanted pastors who could reconcile new archaeological evidence with traditional faith, rather than prophets who proclaimed uncomfortable revelations. Churches that took scroll implications seriously often lost members to denominations that ignored them entirely. The psychology of belief creates powerful resistance to information that threatens existing worldviews. When people have built their identities around particular understanding of history or scripture, contradictory evidence feels like personal attack rather than scholarly advancement. Emotional investment makes objective evaluation nearly impossible. Power structures depend on controlling information flows to maintain authority and legitimacy. Religious institutions, academic departments, and political movements all have stakes in preserving narratives that support their positions. The scrolls threaten multiple power centers simultaneously, creating coordinated resistance to their full revelation. Yet, human curiosity proves remarkably persistent despite institutional pressure and personal comfort. Sarah Chen represents thousands of scholars who risk everything to pursue questions that matter more than career advancement. The same drive that sent explorers across oceans and scientists into laboratories compels researchers to seek truth wherever it leads. The internet age has transformed this dynamic by making information suppression much more difficult. Digital copies circulate beyond institutional control. Leaked documents appear on websites that transcend national boundaries. The old gatekeeping systems that managed controversial discoveries for decades have largely collapsed under technological pressure. This democratization of access creates new problems alongside new opportunities. Amateur researchers without proper training make claims that professional scholars must spend time debunking. Conspiracy theorists exploit legitimate questions about institutional secrecy to promote unfounded speculation. Signal becomes harder to distinguish from noise. The economic incentives around controversial discoveries also complicate truth-seeking efforts. Publishers want sensational claims that sell books rather than careful analysis that advances knowledge. Documentary producers prefer dramatic narratives over nuanced scholarship. Market forces push toward oversimplification and exaggeration. Social media amplifies these distortions by rewarding content that generates strong emotional responses. Measured scholarly conclusions get fewer clicks than breathless revelations about hidden truths. The algorithms that determine what people see prioritize engagement over accuracy. The polarization of contemporary society makes neutral evaluation of controversial evidence increasingly difficult. People approach scroll discoveries with predetermined positions based on their religious or political commitments. Evidence gets filtered through ideological frameworks that determine conclusions before investigation begins. Educational systems struggle to teach critical thinking skills that would help people evaluate complex historical claims. Students learn to memorize information rather than assess evidence. They graduate without tools necessary for distinguishing reliable sources from unreliable ones or recognizing their own cognitive biases. The specialization of academic disciplines creates additional barriers to understanding complex topics like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Archaeologists, linguists, historians, and theologians approach the same materials from different perspectives with different methodologies. Interdisciplinary synthesis becomes difficult when experts cannot communicate across professional boundaries. Legal and ethical frameworks for managing archaeological discoveries remain inadequate for addressing questions raised by materials like the scrolls. National sovereignty, cultural heritage, religious freedom, and scholarly access create competing claims that legal systems struggle to balance. International cooperation breaks down when interests conflict. The temporal distance between ancient texts and modern interpreters creates interpretive challenges that go beyond simple translation difficulties. We bring contemporary assumptions and categories to materials produced in radically different cultural contexts. Understanding requires imaginative reconstruction of worldviews that no longer exist. The commercialization of archaeology introduces additional complications when scholarly research becomes entangled with tourism, fundraising, and marketing concerns. Sites like Qumran must balance preservation with public access, education with entertainment, accuracy with appeal to diverse audiences. Climate change and political instability threaten both the physical preservation of archaeological sites and the institutional stability necessary for long-term research projects. Materials that survived for 2 millennia in desert caves now face risks from human conflict and environmental degradation that could destroy them within decades. The rise of artificial intelligence offers new tools for analyzing ancient texts while raising questions about the role of human interpretation in understanding historical materials. Computers can identify patterns that human scholars miss, but they cannot provide the cultural context and intuitive insight that meaning-making requires. Religious fundamentalism in various traditions creates resistance to historical critical methods that treat sacred texts as human documents subject to ordinary analytical techniques. When faith commitments require particular conclusions about textual origins and meanings, scholarly investigation becomes threatening rather than illuminating. The globalization of higher education has created opportunities for international collaboration on scroll research while exposing Western academic assumptions to challenge from scholars trained in different intellectual traditions. Non-European perspectives on ancient Middle Eastern materials offer fresh insights while revealing cultural biases in established interpretations. The question of who has authority to interpret ancient texts becomes increasingly complex in pluralistic societies where religious, secular, and indigenous communities advance competing claims about cultural heritage and historical meaning. Democratic ideals of equal access conflict with expertise-based authority claims. The mental health implications of pursuing dangerous truths deserve more attention than they typically receive. Scholars who challenge powerful institutions or cherished beliefs often face isolation, harassment, and career destruction. The psychological costs of truth-telling can be severe for individuals while benefiting society overall. Sarah Chen saves her files and closes her laptop as dawn breaks outside her apartment window. She knows that publishing her research will create controversy and possibly end her academic career. But she also knows that truth matters more than personal comfort, that future generations deserve honest answers to honest questions, that the voices from Qumran deserve to be heard, regardless of what they say about contemporary beliefs. Her choice represents the eternal human struggle between safety and knowledge, between belonging and integrity, between comfortable illusion and uncomfortable truth. The Dead Sea Scrolls have forced thousands of people to make similar choices over the past 7 decades. They will continue forcing such choices as long as humans possess both the courage to seek truth and the wisdom to recognize how painful truth can be. In the end, the scrolls teach us that heresy and orthodoxy are human categories that have little to do with historical accuracy or spiritual value. What matters is not whether discoveries conform to our expectations, but whether we have the honesty to follow evidence wherever it leads and the humility to admit when our cherished beliefs need revision. The human need to know ultimately outweighs the human need to be comfortable, but the tension between these drives never fully resolves. The scrolls were never silent. The shepherd stone arcs through desert air and crashes into clay, shattering a secret that was never meant to stay hidden. In that moment of impact, the sound echoes across centuries, awakening voices that had been waiting in darkness for nearly 2,000 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls were never really lost. They were simply sleeping, dreaming of the day when human hands would once again unfold their ancient truths. Time moves differently in the caves above Qumran. While empires rose and fell in the world outside, while Christianity conquered Rome and Islam swept across the Middle East, while crusaders and pilgrims fought over holy sites, the scrolls waited in patient silence. They watched through cracks in stone as history rewrote itself again and again, each generation claiming exclusive truth, while the real witnesses lay wrapped in linen just beyond reach. The Essenes who hid these texts understood something that their persecutors never grasped. Words possess power that transcends the people who speak them. Ideas survive the destruction of the communities that birth them. Truth outlasts the institutions that try to suppress it. When Roman legions marched toward Qumran in 68 CE, the scrolls were already beyond their reach, protected by darkness and time until the moment was right for revelation. Every attempt to silence these voices only amplified their eventual impact. The temple authorities who drove the Essenes into the desert inadvertently preserved alternative versions of scripture that would challenge later claims about biblical inerrancy. The Roman destruction that scattered Jewish communities across the Mediterranean also scattered seeds of Essene thought that would influence early Christian development in ways that historians are still discovering. The medieval church that carefully controlled which texts survived and which disappeared could not reach into sealed caves to edit manuscripts that contradicted their theological constructions. The Islamic conquests that transformed the religious landscape of Palestine passed over Qumran without disturbing the sleep of its ancient guardians. The Crusades that fought over sacred sites never found the most sacred site of all. Even the Ottoman Empire that ruled this region for 4 centuries never suspected that the greatest treasure in their domain lay hidden in caves that looked empty to casual observation. The British mandate that brought modern archaeology to Palestine ended just as the scrolls emerged from their hiding places, as if waiting for the moment when scientific methods could properly preserve and study their contents. The timing of their discovery seems almost prophetic in retrospect. The establishment of Israel in 1948 provided a homeland for a people whose ancient texts had just emerged from the desert. The development of carbon dating techniques allowed precise determination of their age. The invention of photography enabled their preservation without damage from handling. Even the political circumstances that kept them controversial ensured that they would receive attention from scholars worldwide. Every attempt to control their message has ultimately failed. The academic monopoly that hoarded them for decades only increased public fascination with their content. The religious institutions that tried to manage their interpretation found themselves challenged by independent scholars who asked uncomfortable questions. The political movements that claimed them for nationalist purposes discovered that ancient texts refused to serve modern agendas without resistance. The scrolls have spoken through every medium that human ingenuity has invented. They whispered through scholarly articles that most people never read. They proclaimed their truths through popular books that reached millions. They found voices in documentaries that brought their stories to television screens around the world. They adapted to digital formats that make them accessible to anyone with internet connection. Their influence extends far beyond the boundaries of scholarship and religious studies. Artists have drawn inspiration from their imagery of light battling darkness. Musicians have composed works based on their Thanksgiving hymns. Novelists have crafted stories around their mysterious origins and dramatic discovery. They have entered popular culture in ways that ensure their survival regardless of academic fashion or religious politics. The questions they raise refuse to be answered with simple formulas or traditional categories. They force us to reconsider the relationships between Judaism and Christianity, between orthodoxy and heresy, between community and individual, between this world and the world to come. Every generation that encounters them must wrestle with implications that previous generations could not fully grasp. They have taught us humility about the limitations of human knowledge and the provisional nature of historical understanding. Confident assertions about the origins of Christianity or the development of Judaism must now account for evidence that complicates every simple narrative. The scrolls remind us that the past was more complex than the present can easily comprehend. They have also taught us courage about the importance of asking difficult questions and following evidence wherever it leads. The scholars who risked careers to study them, the journalists who exposed attempts at suppression, the ordinary people who demanded access to humanity's heritage, all participated in a struggle for truth that the scrolls themselves inspire. The digital age has given them new voices that reach audiences their ancient authors never could have imagined. Pixels on screens display Hebrew characters that scribes once traced by candlelight. Algorithms search their texts for patterns that human eyes might miss. Artificial intelligence helps translate languages that few people still speak fluently. Yet something essential remains unchanged from the moment when Essene hands first shaped these letters on parchment. The fundamental human questions that drove ancient scribes to preserve these texts continue driving modern readers to study them. What does it mean to be human? How should we relate to the divine? What obligations do we have to each other and to future generations? The scrolls offer no easy answers to these eternal questions, but they provide evidence that people have been asking them for millennia. They connect us to ancestors who struggled with doubt and faith, who built communities and watched them fail, who preserved wisdom and saw it ignored by their contemporaries. Their voices remind us that we are not alone in our questioning. The caves that once protected them now stand empty, their treasures removed to climate-controlled storage facilities and museum displays. But the caves remember. When desert winds blow through Qumran at dawn, they carry echoes of voices that refuse to be silenced. The stones that witnessed ancient rituals and midnight copying sessions still bear the presence of people who believed their words would matter to future generations. They were right. The scrolls matter now more than ever. In an age when competing claims about truth threaten to tear apart the fabric of civilized discourse, they offer a model of how diverse communities can maintain distinctive beliefs while engaging in serious dialogue with different perspectives. They show us how to preserve tradition while remaining open to new understanding. The shepherd who threw that stone in 1947 could not have known that he was awakening voices that would speak to millions of people across the world. The cave that echoed with the sound of breaking pottery now echoes with conversations in languages that did not exist when the scrolls were hidden. The silence has been broken forever, but perhaps there was never really silence at all. Perhaps the scrolls were always speaking to those who had ears to hear. Perhaps every generation that passed by their hiding places received some echo of their message, some whisper of alternative possibilities, some suggestion that official stories never contain the whole truth. Now their voices join the great conversation of humanity that spans millennia and continents, connecting ancient wisdom with contemporary questions, desert caves with digital networks, candlelit scriptorium with university classrooms. They remind us that truth is always larger than the institutions that claim to possess it, that wisdom comes from unexpected places, that the most important messages often hide in the most unlikely locations. The Dead Sea Scrolls were never silent. They were simply waiting for the right moment to join their voices to the chorus of human seeking that defines our species at its best. Now that they have spoken, they will never be silent again. Their words have entered the stream of human consciousness, where they will flow forward into whatever future our descendants create. In the end, they teach us that preservation and revelation are acts of faith in human possibility. The Essenes who hid them believed that future generations would be worthy of their trust. We who have found them must prove worthy of that faith by listening carefully to what they say and by passing their voices forward to those who will come after us. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is not finished. It continues in every classroom where students encounter their texts, in every laboratory where scientists study their materials, in every moment when someone reads their words and feels connected across time to the community of seekers who wrote them. They were hidden. They were forbidden. But they were never forgotten, because truth has a way of preserving itself against all odds, against all opposition, against all attempts to silence it forever. The scrolls are proof that words matter, that ideas survive, that the human hunger for understanding cannot be satisfied with easy answers or official dogmas. They are proof that somewhere in the darkness, truth is always waiting for its moment to speak.